Counter-Rev Audio. May 2021. The Fourth Political Theory by Alexander Dugin. First English edition published in 2012 by Arctos Media Limited, London. By Slavic Orthodox civilization, it is more accurate to understand Eurasian civilization, to which belong historically, organically and culturally not only the Slavs and not only the Orthodox, but also other ethnicities, including the Turks, Caucasians, Siberians and so on, and a significant portion of the population professing Islam. The Islamic world itself, undoubtedly, united religiously with the constantly growing awareness of its own identity, in its turn is separated into a few large spaces: the Arab world, the zone of continental Islam, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the diffusion of Islam in the Pacific region. A special place in this picture is occupied by the Muslims of Africa, but also by the constantly growing communities of Europe and America. And nevertheless, Islam is precisely a civilization, more and more recognizing its peculiarity and its difference from other civilizations, and in the first place from liberal Western civilization, which has been actively treading upon the Islamic world in the course of globalization. It is complicated to establish borders between the zones of influence of Japanese and Chinese civilization in the Pacific region, whose civilizational identity remains open to a significant degree. And of course, it is difficult for now to speak of a common consciousness of the inhabitants of the African continent, although in the future this situation might change, inasmuch as in the present process there is at any rate historical precedent, such as in the African Union, but also in the existence of a Pan-African idea. The growing intimacy between the countries of Latin America in recent years is evident, especially considering the fact of North American pressure, although it is too early for now to speak of processes of integration. There are no existing barriers at all to the integration of the Eurasian expanse around Russia, inasmuch as these zones were politically, culturally, economically, socially and psychologically united during the course of many centuries. The western border of the Eurasianist civilization goes somewhat more east of the western border of the Ukraine, making that newly formulated government a fortiori fragile and not viable. Essentially, the enumeration of civilizations gives us an idea of the quantity of poles in a multipolar world. All of them besides the West dwell, so far, in a potential condition, but at the same time each of these civilizations has serious, impressive grounds to move toward integration and to become a full-fledged subject of the history of the 21st century. The multipolar ideal. The idea of a multipolar world, where the poles will be as many as there are civilizations, allows one to propose to humanity a broad choice of cultural, paradigmatic, social and spiritual alternatives. We shall have a model with the availability of regional universalism in concrete large spaces, which will give to enormous zones and significant segments of humanity an unavoidable social dynamic characteristic of globalization and openness, but without those shortcomings that globalization has taken on a global scale. Moreover, in such a system, regionalism and the autonomous and independent development of local, ethnic and religious communities can be developed at full speed, inasmuch as the more unifying pressure, characteristic of national governments, weakens considerably. We see this in the European Union, where integration considerably facilitates the development of local communes and so-called Euroregions. In addition, we shall be able at last to decide the fundamental contradiction between exclusivism and inclusivism of the imperial identity. The planet will present itself not as one sole ecumene, with the inherent cultural racism of this solitariness in the distribution of the titles of civilized nations, as opposed to barbarians and savages, but as a few ecumenes, a few heavens, where there will live side by side in their rhythm, in their context, in their own time, with their own consciousness and unconsciousness, not one humanity but a few. It is impossible to say beforehand how relations between them will turn out. Surely, both dialogue and collisions will emerge. But something else is more important: history will continue, and we will return from that fundamental historical dead end to which uncritical faith in progress, rationality, and the gradual development of humanity drove us. Something in man changes with time, but something remains eternal and invariable. Civilization allows one to strictly develop everything in its place. Reason and the philosophical, social, political, and economic systems created by it will be able to develop according to their own lines, while the collective unconscious will freely preserve its archetypes, its basis, and inviolability. Moreover, in every civilization, both rationality and the unconscious can affirm their own standards, secure their correctness, and strengthen them or change them according to its own discretion. There will be no universal standard, neither in the material nor in the spiritual aspect. Each civilization will at last receive the right to freely proclaim that which is, according to its wishes, the measure of things. Somewhere that will be man, somewhere religion, somewhere ethics, somewhere materialism. But in order that the project of multipolarity can realize itself, we must still survive more than a few skirmishes. And in the first place, it is necessary to get the better of the first and foremost enemy, globalization, the striving of the Atlantic Western Pole to hang its unipolar hegemony on all the nations and countries on Earth. Despite the deep and sure observations of its own best intellectuals, many representatives of the political establishment of the USA continue as before to use the term civilization in a singular sense, understanding by it American civilization. This is the real challenge to which all nations of the earth, and Russians most of all, must give an adequate response. 8. The transformation of the left in the 21st century. The leftist philosophy in crisis. In contrast to the situation that ruled in the sphere of political ideas and projects 100 years ago, to speak of the presence of some kind of clearly determined space for leftist, socialist, or communist projects is now impossible. The problem is that, at the end of the 20th century, there occurred a fundamental crisis of expectations, connected with leftist movements, leftist ideas, leftist philosophy, and leftist politics. This is above all connected to the breakup of the Soviet Union and the falling apart of the socialist camp, and also to the loss of influence and prestige of European Marxism, which at a specific time practically became the reserve ideology of Western Europe. Moreover, even at the best of times, the leftist project was not something uniform and universal, and the fate of leftist ideas in the concrete political practice of various peoples showed that, even from a purely theoretical point of view, within the leftist political philosophy itself, various foundational tendencies exist, which one should study separately. Leftist political philosophy from the beginning was thought of as a fundamental, general and systematic criticism of liberal capitalism. In the middle of the 20th century, there arose the phenomenon of a systematic critique of the leftist project, both from the side of liberals Hayek, Popper, Aron, and so on, as well as from the side of neo-Marxists and Freudian Marxists. With the leftist ideology itself, the philosophical schools carried out the same thing that the leftist ideology carried out concerning liberal capitalism 100 or 150 years ago. 3 varieties of leftist ideology. From the position of today's historical experience, one can identify 3 foundational directions in leftist political philosophy, which either continue along a new branch of previous ideological development, rethink the past, or offer something radically new. They are the Old Left, French, Vétérogauche; Left Nationalists, National Communists, National Bolsheviks or National Gauchists; New Left, Neo-Gauchists, Postmoderns. The first 2 tendencies existed at the end of the 19th century, and throughout the 20th century, and to some degree they are present in today's world. The third orientation appeared in the 1950s and 1960s and developed out of a criticism of the old leftists, which gradually appeared in the course of postmodernity and influenced the aesthetics, stylistics, and philosophy of modern Western society to a great extent. The Old Left today, the blind alley of orthodoxy, perspectives of evolutionary strategy, and pro-liberal revisionism. The Old Left are now divided into a few orientations. Orthodox Marxists. Social Democrats. Post-social democrats, adherents of the Third Way, along the lines of Giddens. European Orthodox Marxists. By inertia, they exist in European countries and also in the United States and Third World countries, continuing to defend the foundational premises of Marxist thought. They are often embodied in communist parties, professing the corresponding ideology. In the majority of cases, those orthodox Marxists soften, in the spirit of Eurocommunism, the radicality of Marx's teaching, rejecting the call to a revolutionary uprising and the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat. The most lasting form of orthodox Marxism turned out to be the Trotskyite movement, the Fourth International, which was almost untouched by the fall of the USSR and the breakup of the Soviet system, so far as it initially originated from a hard critique of that system. It is characteristic that the more orthodox followers of Marx meet in those countries where the proletarian, socialist revolutions did not occur, although Marx himself predicted that, precisely in the more developed industrial countries with a working capitalist economy, these revolutions were destined to take place. European Marxism in some sense accepted the fact that Marx and Engels' predictions were realized, not where by all logic they should have been realized, but on the contrary, where it was thought that they could never be realized under any conditions, such as Russia. Rejecting the Soviet experience as a historical stretch, this variety of old leftists in practice does not believe in the success of Marxist prophecies, but continues to defend their views rather as being faithful in the moral sense and to the ideological tradition, rather than seriously counting on the revolutionary uprising of the proletariat who, in the modern Western world, it seems, no longer exist as a class, to such a degree has it merged with the petty bourgeoisie. The most important shortcoming of Western Orthodox Marxists consists in their continuing to operate using the terms of the industrial society at a time when Western European and especially American society have moved to a qualitatively new stage, the post-industrial information society, of which almost nothing is said in classical Marxism, excluding the troubled intuitions of the young Marx about the real domination of capital. In the absence or failure of the socialist revolutions, this can come as a replacement of the formal domination of capital, characteristic of the industrial age. But even these fragmentary observations of the orthodox Marxists, as a rule, do not spark great interest and are not at the center of attention. Gradually, the prognostic and political meaning of such orthodox Marxist discourse comes to naught, and this means that to speak of their ideas as a project, even a leftist project, is not possible. At the same time, their critical observations concerning the capitalist system, moral views, solidarity with the unfortunate, and the criticism of liberalism can arouse definite interest and sympathy. The adherents of this persuasion almost always relate only with distrust to other anti-liberal theories, and are typically closed to dialogue and are degenerating into a sect. European social democracy. European social democrats differ slightly from orthodox communists. This political current also derives from Marxism, but already in the epoch of Kautsky it selected not a revolutionary, but an evolutionary path, repudiating radicalism and placing its goal in influencing politics in the leftist manner, social justice, the welfare state, etc., by parliamentary means and through organized labor movements. This version of the old left achieved considerable results in European countries, having predetermined to a large degree the socio-political aspect of European society, in sharp contrast to the United States, where, on the contrary, the right liberal doctrine undoubtedly prevails. The purpose of the social democratic orientation of the old left in our time comes down to economic theses, which oppose liberal tendencies. Social democrats come out in favor of 1. Progressive income tax, liberals, for flat tax. 2. The nationalization of large monopolies, liberals, for privatization. 3. The broadening of government responsibility in the social sector. 4. Free medicine, education, guaranteed pension plans, liberals, for reducing government influence in the economy, private medicine, education and pension plans. Social Democrats try to realize these demands through parliamentary electoral mechanisms and, in critical situations, through the mobilization of labor unions and social organizations, right up to strikes. It is significant that for Social Democrats, the characteristic slogans are libertarian, not to be confused with liberal. The legalization of light narcotics, the protection of sexual and ethnic minorities and homosexual marriages, the broadening of individual rights and civic freedom, the development of the institutions of civil society, ecology, the softening of criminal penal codes, repealing capital punishment, and so on. Classical Social Democrats combine the demands of leftist economics, social justice, strengthening the role of government, with the broadening of personal rights and civic freedoms, human rights, the development of democracy, and internationalism. Today it is accepted to speak of multiculturalism and globalization. The project of classical Social Democrats, directed toward the future, is the continuation of such a politics of concrete steps along a socio-political evolution, in argument with the right, both with liberals in economics and with national conservatives in politics. Most often, classical Social Democrats are also for progress, for the battle against archaic and religious prejudices, for science and culture. At the same time, there are no serious theoretical developments regarding the new conditions of post-industrial society discussed in this camp, and both the criticism of classical Marxism and the thematization of capitalism on the new historical stage, in contrast to the postmodernists and the New Left, are almost entirely absent from them. Socialists of the Third Way. One more version of the Old Left is an orientation of Social Democrats, which in the face of the evident upsurge of liberal ideas in 1990 to 2000 decided to compromise with liberals. The theoreticians of this orientation, in particular, the Englishman Anthony Giddens, called it the Third Way, something between classical European social democracy and American, more generally, Anglo-Saxon, liberalism. Proponents of the Third Way propose to find a compromise between Social Democrats and Liberal Democrats on the basis of their common ideological roots in the Enlightenment and their common dislike both of conservatism and of leftist extremism. The platform for compromise is constructed in terms of give and take relating to concrete arrangements concerning the extent to which Social Democrats agree to lower the progressive tax in the direction of the flat tax, while liberals raise the latter in the direction of the former. Concerning the rights of man, there are no principal disagreements between them about guaranteeing minority rights or about multiculturalism, if we do not consider liberal conservatives, who combine the idea of a flat income tax with conservative principles of the family, morals, and religion as American rights, such as the Republicans and neocons. The purpose of the Third Way project, according to Giddens, consists in the cooperation of Social Democrats and liberals in the construction of a European society, founding itself on a broadening of personal rights, preservation of the institutions of private ownership, and a modification of the ability of government to intervene and the mechanism of redistribution in each concrete instance, in deliberately established limits. In contrast to classical Social Democrats and even European communists, the adherents of the Third Way relate sympathetically to the USA and insist on strengthening the Atlantic Alliance, whereas typical leftists, both old and new, harshly criticize America and American society for its liberalism, inequality, and imperialism. If there are real renegades among the leftist movements, then these are precisely the followers of the Third Way. Next come former Trotskyites, such as certain Americans, the theoretical founders of neoconservatism, or Europeans, for instance the head of the European Commission, the Portuguese Barroso, who changed their views from extreme communism and revolutionary socialism for a no less radical defense of liberalism, the market, and economic inequality. The leftist project in the case of Third Way socialists is to preserve the status quo. National communism, conceptual paradoxes, ideological imbalances, subterranean energies. National Gauchism should be understood as a perfectly unique phenomenon. In contrast to orthodox Marxism and social democracy, this orientation is studied much less, and its correct deciphering is a matter for the future. The problem is that National Gauchism almost never parades its national component, covering it up or even repudiating it. Consequently, the study of the direct and honest discourse of the national communist movements, parties or regimes themselves most often becomes more difficult because of the fact that the theses they discuss either correspond to reality only in part, or else not at all. We meet deliberate, open and unbroken national gauchist discourse only on the periphery of those regimes and political parties that, in themselves, profess and realize this ideological model, refusing, however, to admit this. For that reason, National Gauchism dodges direct, rational study, preferring to safeguard half of the phenomenon. Whatever is tied to the national is in the shade. National communists themselves reckon themselves as being simply communists and orthodox Marxists, strictly following the teachings of the communist classics. In order to understand what the discussion is really about, it suffices to propose the following criterion: socialist, proletarian revolutions were victorious only in those countries that Marx thought were entirely unprepared for them by virtue of the following: their agrarian character, underdevelopment or lack of capitalist relations, a paucity of urban proletarians, weak industrialization, the preservation of the fundamental social conditions of traditional societies in virtue of their belonging to pre-modernity. And this is the fundamental paradox of Marxism, where socialism was supposed to be victorious, and where all conditions came together to this end, it was not victorious, although purely theoretically it was there that orthodox Marxist parties and trends existed, and are in part still preserved. But in those places where, according to Marx, the socialist revolution could in no way win, they won triumphantly. The victorious communists, in the first place the Russian Bolsheviks, carefully tried to cover up and retouch this obvious lack of correspondence to the prognosis of their teacher, never subjecting it to careful analysis, preferring to arbitrarily build a reality under their speculative constructions driving society, politics and economics under abstract criteria, artistically and mechanically. And only foreign observers, sympathizers or critics, noticed this national communistic character of successful Marxist revolutions, recognizing nationalistic elements as a driving factor and virtue, providing these revolutions with success and stability via archaic national stories of the mobilization of Marxism as a nationally interpreted eschatological myth. Sorel was one of the first to notice this. Ustryalov noticed a little later. Savitsky, the Germans Niekisch, Patel, Loftenberg, Wolfheim and others from the side of the sympathizers, Popper, Hayek, Cohn, Aaron from the side of the critics. National communism ruled in the USSR, Communist China, North Korea, Vietnam, Albania, Cambodia, and also in many communist movements of the Third World, from the Mexican Chiapas and Peruvian Sendero Luminoso, the Golden Path, to the Kurdish Workers' Party and Islamic socialism. Leftist socialist elements were found in the fascism of Mussolini and in the National Socialism of Hitler, but in these cases, these elements were fragmentary, not systematized and superficial, exhibited more in marginal or sporadic phenomena. Left Italian fascism only occurred in its early futurist phase and in the Italian Social Republic, and the leftist anti-Hitler National Socialism of the Strasser brothers, or the anti-Hitler underground of the National Bolsheviks Schulz-Boysen and so forth, neither of which was permitted any place within the regime of the Third Reich. Although it would seem, according to the formal signs and title, we should relate National Socialism to this category, there was no pure socialism as such, there rather statism, multiplied by the invocation of the archaic energies of the ethnos and race. But in Soviet Bolshevism, very precisely indicated by the Smeena-Vec author Nikolai Ustryalov as National Bolshevism, very evidently both beginnings are present, the social and the national, although this time around, the national did not receive a conceptual formulation. Up to the present day, many political movements, for instance in Latin America, are inspired by this complex of ideas, while the political regimes of Cuba, Venezuela, or Bolivia, Evo Morales is the first South American leader of native Indian heritage, or Ollanta Humala, the supporters of whom are close to seizing power in Peru, and other national communist movements are full-blown political realities. Either a governmental system is already founded on them, or else this could happen in the near future. And everywhere where communism has a realistic chance, there we face leftist ideas that have been multiplied by national, ethnic, archaic energies and are implemented along the lines of traditional society. Basically, this is neo-Orthodox Marxism, sui generis national Marxism, however it would characterize itself. But where there are all the classical prerequisites, according to Marx, for its realization: industrial society, the development of heavy industry, an urban proletarian, and so on, socialist revolutions did not occur, with the exception of the ephemeral Bavarian Republic, are not occurring, and most likely will never occur. The meaning of leftist nationalism, national gauchism, consists in the mobilization of archaic foundations local, as a rule in order to break away to the surface and exhibit itself in socio-political creativity. Here socialist theory comes into play, serving as a sort of interface for those energies, without which it would be forced to remain a strictly local phenomena. But thanks to Marxism, however understood and interpreted, these national energies receive the possibility of communicating with other energies, analogical by nature but different structurally, and can even claim universality and planetary breadth, transforming, thanks to a socialist rationality warmed up by nationalism, into a messianic project. The grandiose experience of the USSR shows how large-scale the National Communist Initiative can be, having produced for almost a century a fundamental headache for all the world's capitalist systems. China, meanwhile, even today in a new context, accentuating more and more the national component of its socio-political model, proves that this foundation, in good time and delicately worked, can remain competitive, even after the global triumph of liberal capitalism. The experience of Venezuela and Bolivia, for its part, illustrates that national communist regimes arise even in our time, and demonstrate their capacity for life in the face of great pressure. North Korea, Vietnam and Cuba, as before, maintain their political systems from Soviet times, not adopting such market reforms as China adopted, and not giving up their positions, as the USSR did. From a theoretical point of view, in the phenomenon of national gauchism we are faced with Marxism, interpreted in the spirit of archaic eschatological expectations and deep national mythologies, connected to the expectation of the end of times and the return of the Golden Age, cargo cults, millenarianism. The thesis of justice and government rights on which the socialist utopia is built is recognized as religious, which awakens the fundamental tectonic energies of the ethnos. Does national gauchism today have a project for the future? In its completed form, no. It is hampered by a series of factors. The persisting shock of the dissolution of Soviet national communism. Russian Eurasianists even in the 1920s predicted this downfall if the Soviet leadership did not recognize the importance of minding the national and religious myths directly, face to face. The lack of a conceptualization and rationalization of the national component in the general ideological complex of national communist movements and ideologies. The absolute majority of supporters of this ideological orientation truly reckon themselves to be simply Marxists or socialists. The weak institutional communication of national Bolshevik circles between themselves on a global scale. There are no serious, large-scale conferences on this theme, no theoretical journals are published, or, if they are, they remain marginalized, and there are no philosophical developments. Nevertheless, in my opinion, national gauchism could certainly have a global future, insofar as among many segments of humanity archaic, ethnic and religious energies are far from being spent, whatever can be said of the citizens of the modern, enlightened and rational West. The new left, anti-globalism, postmodern paths, labyrinths of freedom to the advent of post-humanity. More than anything today, that which is called the new left, neo-gauchism or postmodernism fits the word combination leftist project. Amidst the whole spectrum of leftist ideas at the start of the 21st century, precisely this orientation is not only the most bright and blazing, but also the most thought out, intellectually adjusted and systematized. New leftists appeared in the 1950s and 1960s in Europe on the periphery of the leftist flank of Marxists, Trotskyites, and anarchists. Marx was the sine qua non for them, but they also actively used other theoretical and philosophical sources, in contrast to the old leftists, bringing imported elements into their own theory without disturbance. For that reason, Marxism in this form actively broadened, while constantly juxtaposing with other philosophical conceptions, developed itself, rethought itself, subjected itself to criticism, in short, became an object of concentrated reflection. Such an unrestricted relation of the New Left to Marxism produced two results. On one hand, it became diluted, on the other, it modernized essentially. The philosophers of suspicion, drawing not only on Marx, but also on Freud and Nietzsche, exerted a great influence upon the philosophy of the New Leftists. Through Sartre, one of the classic theorists of the New Leftists, the deep influence of Martin Heidegger and the existential problem penetrated into the leftist movement. Structuralism had a colossal significance, from the most important theoreticians of structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure to Levi Strauss. In a philosophical sense, New Leftists were themselves structuralists, while in the second half of the 1980s, developing this philosophical impulse further, they moved on to post-structuralism, having exposed to systematic critical reflection their own views of the 1960s and 1970s. The New Leftists approached Marxism from a structuralist position, that is, they thought that Marx's most important idea of Marx's concerned the fundamental influence of understructures, in the usual case, bourgeois society, carefully hidden from ideological consciousness, in relation to a superstructure. The Marxist analysis of ideology as false consciousness became, for the New Leftists, the key to the interpretation of society, philosophy, man, and the economy. But that same train of thought they discovered from Nietzsche, who had raised the whole spectrum of philosophical ideas to the primordial will to power. This was its very basis, according to Nietzsche, and from Freud, for whom the base was the subconscious and unconscious impulses, rooted in the mineral foundations of man's sexuality and the habitual structures that form in early childhood. To this was added the Heideggerian model, where the base is the fact of pure existence, Dasein. All the various decipherings of the base were aggregated by the New Leftists into a general scheme, where the role of the base, as such regardless of a concrete philosophical tendency, was carried over into the notion of structure. Structure, that is, simultaneous industrial forces reproduced in industrial relations, the subconscious, the will to power, and Dasein. The basic idea of the New Leftists is that bourgeois society is a result of many-faceted violence and oppression by the superstructures of the bourgeoisie political system, ordinary consciousness, the rule of elites, generally accepted philosophical systems, science, society, the market economy, and so on, bases and structures, also understood very broadly, including unconscious, proletariat, corporeity, mass, the experience of authentic existence, freedom and justice. By such means, the New Leftists, in contrast to the old leftists, mount a systematic, critical attack on capitalist society simultaneously from all directions, from the political, the events of May 1968 in European capitals, to the cultural, philosophical, artistic, the very presentation of man, reason, science, and reality. In the course of this massive intellectual work, to which, incidentally, neither the old leftists nor the national gauchists paid the slightest attention, the New Leftists came to the conclusion that capitalism is not only socio-political evil, but the fundamental expression of a global lie concerning man, reality, reason, and society, and consequently, in capitalist society, as in the resulting moments, is concentrated the whole history of alienation. The New Leftists reanimated Rousseau's idea of the noble savage and proposed an extensive panorama of an ideal society without exploitation, alienation, lies, suppression, or exclusion, by analogy with the archaic groups which are motivated by the economy of the gift and Moss. The analysis of the New Leftists showed that modernity not only did not realize in practice its liberation slogans, but made the dictatorship of alienation even more rigid and repulsive, although hidden behind democratic and liberal facades. In this manner was the theory of postmodernism assembled, founded on the fact that, at the very foundation of the picture of the world, science, philosophy, and political ideologies, which had been assembled at the dawn of the epoch of modernity or in the course of its development, are strained interpretations, infelicities, delusions, and racist presuppositions, which even theoretically block the possibility of liberating the structure, the base, from superstructures. This led to the reconsideration of the philosophical tradition of modernity with the unmasking of those mechanisms that concentrate the nodes of alienation in themselves. This practice received the name Deconstruction, which proposes a careful and thorough structural analysis of the context from which one or another idea proceeded, with a detailed exarticulation of the substantial nuclei from out of the layer of pathos, moralism, rhetorical figures, and conscious juggling. Foucault, in History of Madness and the Birth of the Clinic, showed that the contemporary relation to psychological disorders, and, more broadly, to disease as such, carries all the signs of intellectual racism, apartheid, and other totalitarian prejudices that become evident in the equation of the sick with the criminal and in the structural identity of penitential and therapeutic establishments, having been one and the same in the early stages of modernity. Bourgeois society, despite its mimicry and democratic facade, proves to be a totalitarian and disciplinarian society. What is more, at the center of this liberal dictatorship, the new leftists recognize the deep and almost never doubted normative notions of reason, science, reality, society, and so on, and not only one or the other political and economic mechanisms, which are themselves consequences of the deep mechanisms of alienation. In this consists the main difference between the new leftists and the old leftists. The new leftists doubt the structure of reason, they contest the basis of our conception of reality, disrobe positive science as a mystification and dictatorship of the academic circles, Feyerabend, Kuhn, and sharply criticize the concept of man as a totalitarian abstraction. They do not believe that it is possible to change something by the path of evolution in the leftist manner of the existing system, but also contest the effectiveness of radical Marxism, noting that it did not overcome what it was supposed to, and that where it did, it was not orthodox Marxism. They borrow from Trotsky the criticism of Stalinism and the Soviet experience. And so the new leftists formulate a vast project of the correct future, in which the central place is occupied by the rejection of reason, the call to the conscious adoption of schizophrenia by Deleuze and Guattari, the renunciation of man as the measure of all things, the death of man of Levi, the death of the author of Barthes, the overcoming of all sexual taboos, freedom to choose one's orientation, renunciation of the prohibition on incest, a refusal to recognize perversion as perversion, and so on. The legalization of all kinds of narcotics, including the hard ones. A move to new forms of spontaneous and sporadic being, the rhizome of Deleuze. The destruction of structural society and government in the service of new, free, and anarchical communes. The book Empire by Negri and Hart, in which are given the theses of the new leftists, can be read as a political manifesto of these tendencies, simplified to the point of primitiveness. Negri and Hart call the global capitalistic system empire and identify it with globalism and American world government. In their opinion, globalism creates the conditions for a universal, planetary revolution of the masses who, using the common character of globalism and its possibilities for communication and the wide, open spread of knowledge, create a network of world sabotage for the shift from humanity, standing out as the subject and object of oppression, hierarchical relations, exploitation and disciplinarian strategies, to post-humanity, mutants, cyborgs, clones, and virtuality, and the free selection of gender, appearance and individual rationality according to one's arbitrary rule and for any space of time. Negri and Hart think that this will lead to the freeing up of the creative potential of the masses and at the same time to the destruction of the global power of empire. This theme is endlessly repeated in the cinematography in such films as The Matrix, The Boys Club, and so on. The anti-globalization movement in whole is oriented precisely to such a project of the future. And such actions as the conference in Sao Paulo, where anti-globalists first tried to aim at a common strategy, attest that the new leftist project is discovering forms of concrete political realization. Many concrete actions, gay parades, anti-globalization protests, Occupy Wall Street, the disturbances in immigrant suburbs of European cities, the rebellions of autonomous ones in defense of squatters' rights, broad social protests of new labor unions, all reminding one of a carnival, the movement for the legalization of drugs, ecological actions and protests and so on are included in this orientation. Moreover, postmodernism as an artistic style, having become the mainstream of contemporary Western art, expresses this very new left political philosophy, entering our way of life through pictures, design or the films of Tarantino and Rodriguez, without preliminary political philosophical analysis, outrunning our conscious election, hooking itself into our minds without our knowledge or will. This is attended by both a general broadening of virtual communication technologies, which in their own system carry an implicit invitation to postmodernity, and the dispersion into post-human, hedonistic fragments. SMS and MMS messages, internet blogs and video blogs, flash mobs and other habitual engagements of contemporary youth, in essence represent the realization of separate sides of the new left project, while it is true, being controlled by the bourgeoisie system, willingly profiting from a fashion that this time is not its own, but that of its hidden enemy. Here we should say a few words about the relations of the new leftists and anti-globalists to contemporary liberals and globalists. As Marx thought in his time that capitalism, despite its horrors, was more progressive than feudalism and the Middle Ages, since it brings closer the onset of socialism, so contemporary postmodernists and new leftists, while harshly criticizing empire, stand in solidarity with it to some degree, as it, in their opinion, while aggravating alienation and strengthening its planetary dictatorship, latently prepares the world revolution of the masses. Leftists in contemporary Russia. In conclusion, we will say a few words about the state of affairs of leftist forces in contemporary Russia. In practice, we see that we have no old leftists in the full sense of the word, just as we had none in Soviet times. A group of Soviet Marxist dissidents, Zinoviev, Skedovitz, Medvedev, are of no account, inasmuch as they were unable to start any sort of ideological school. National communists, on the other hand, afford by themselves a broad formation social, psychological and political, the leaders of which, in our time, are the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Inasmuch as all Soviet history, marked by the victory of socialism, the true sign of a work that has an archaic foundation, is the history of unconscious National Gauchism, such a steady tendency is not surprising. In the first stages of Zhuganov's creation of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, not without some participation on my part, as well as Prokhanov, which was expressed in the opinion of the newspaper Zavtra, Tomorrow, at the start of the 1990s, efforts were made to interpret and conceptually appraise the presence of the national component in the Soviet worldview, National Bolshevism, but this initiative was abandoned by the leadership of the CPRF, which had occupied itself with some other matters which were apparently more important for it. However, on the level of rhetoric and first reactions, Russian communists in all senses present themselves as confirmed national conservatives, sometimes even as orthodox monarchists. Indeed, average Russians, especially the middle-aged and older generations, are in large part unconscious National Gauchists. They support this complex of ideas whenever the opportunity is afforded them, the party Rodina, and construe in this vein much that has no relation whatsoever to that complex, the social conservatism of United Russia, and even Putin himself. Those same marginalized groups who, imitating European neo-Nazism, attempt to bring out an amalgam National Socialism by name, were never National Gauchists, insofar as they imitate, as a rule, from a deficiency of intellect, the gadgets of Hitler's regime, as it were continuing to play at soldiering in the sandbox, or while watching the program 17 Moments of Spring, delighting in the black as the crow's wing uniform of Bronovoy as Muller. The project of the National Bolshevik Party, which I in my time was preparing to transform into an authentic, Russian, conscious national gauchism on the foundations of the theories of Ustryalov, Nikish, and the leftist Eurasianists, alas, degenerated at the end of the 1990s into hooliganism and senseless organization, and later started to serve the anti-Russian, orange ultraliberal powers, fed by the West, which completely contradicts the fundamental premises of National Bolshevism, which represents, both in theory and in practice, the conscious left being thus a strictly anti-liberal, Russian patriotic and consequently anti-Western project. The new left and the postmodernists in Russia's political spectrum are practically not represented. The philosophical discourse of postmodernism is too complicated for them. A tiny group of conscious, representative, anti-globalists exists, but it is known more in the West and constitutes nothing serious, neither in an organizational nor in a theoretical sense. In Russian art in particular, in the Gelman Gallery at Winzavod, and also in Russian film, postmodern tendencies, on the contrary, are rather clearly evident, and their artistic expressions are at times impressive. The books of Sorokin or Pelevin present postmodernism in a literary form. Moreover, the average artistic, or even technological, which is more important, product of the West carries in itself a not insignificant charge of latent postmodernity, occupying therewith the Russian cultural space with actively functioning signs, which are hammered out in the creative laboratories of the New Left, and are then put on the production line of global industry, which derives a short-term benefit from them and gradually sharpens its own foundations. Russia here performs the role of an inert consumer, not understanding the political and ideological meaning of that which it is buying, automatically following fashions or global trends, and forgetting that every trend has, as the postmodernists say, trendsetters, those who establish a determinate trend for a specific goal. 9. Liberalism and its metamorphoses. In 1932, the German National Bolshevik, Ernst Nikisch, whose ideas were remarkably similar to both the Russian National Bolsheviks, Ustryalov, and the Eurasianists, wrote a book with a revealing title, Hitler, Disaster for Germany. The book went almost unnoticed, but after a few years led him straight to the concentration camps. He turned out to be absolutely right. Hitler had, in fact, appeared to be precisely such a fateful figure for Germany. Fateful, meaning not accidental, well-founded, ingrained in the course of things, joined with the logic of fate, but embodying her darker aspect. And in this book, as in others of his works, Nikisch repeated, in human society there are no fatalities such as those inherent in nature, the changing of the seasons, natural disasters. The dignity of man consists in the fact that he can always say no. He can always rebel. He can always rise and fight against even that which seems inevitable, absolute and unbeatable. And even if he loses, he gives an example to others. And others take his place. And others say no. That's why the most fateful and fated occurrences can be defeated with the strength of the soul. Nikisch fought against Nazism and the Nazis and predicted earlier and more precisely than most others what would be the consequences of their bloody rule for Germany and mankind. He did not give up. He threw down a challenge to evil fate, not putting down his fists. Most importantly, he resisted a strength that seemed invincible with a handful of like-minded anti-Nazis. A group of Nikisch's followers, one of them the National Bolshevik Haro Schulz-Boysen, became the core of the Red Orchestra. It was him, almost blind by then, that the Soviet troops freed from a concentration camp in 1945. He did not see the physical victories for which he gave his life, but until the end of his days he remained convinced that it is necessary to stand opposed to the evil fate of human history, even if it arises from its deepest flywheels. Today the same could be said about liberalism as an ideology, which was victorious in the West and which spreads its influence using many old and new methods across the entire world, supported by superpower number one, the United States. It seems once again that this might is inevitable, not accidental, and follows the same fundamental fateful law which seems to suggest that to argue with this power is useless. But again, as in the case of Ernst Nikisch, people are found who are ready to carry out that same program, only this time not as regarding a separate country, but rather all mankind. Liberalism is the evil fate of human civilization. The battle with it, opposition to it, and refutation of its poisonous dogmas, this is the moral imperative of all honest people on the planet. At all costs, we must, argumentatively and thoroughly, again and again, repeat that truth, even when to do so seems useless, untimely, politically incorrect, and sometimes even dangerous. Liberalism as a summary of Western civilization and its definition. In order to adequately understand the essence of liberalism, we must recognize that it is not accidental, that its appearance in the history of political and economic ideologies is based on fundamental processes, proceeding in all of Western civilization. Liberalism is not only a part of that history, but its purest and most refined expression, its result. This principal observation demands from us a stricter definition of liberalism. Liberalism is a political and economic philosophy and ideology, embodying in itself the most important force lines of the modern age and of the epoch of modernity. The understanding of the individual as the measure of all things. Belief in the sacred character of private property. The assertion of the equality of opportunity as the moral law of society. Belief in the contractual basis of all socio-political institutions, including governmental. The abolition of any governmental, religious and social authorities who lay claim to the common truth. The separation of powers and the making of social systems of control over any government institution whatsoever. The creation of a civil society without races, peoples and religions in place of traditional governments. The dominance of market relations over other forms of politics. The thesis, economics is fate. Certainty that the historical path of Western peoples and countries is a universal model of development and progress for the entire world, which must, in an imperative order, be taken as the standard and pattern. It is specifically these principles which lie at the base of historical liberalism, developed by the philosophers Locke, Mill, Kant, and later Bentham and Constance, right up to the neoliberal school of the 20th century, such as Friedrich Hayek and Karl Popper. Adam Smith, the follower of Locke, on the basis of the ideas of his teacher, analyzed business activity and laid the foundations for political economy, having written the political and economic Bible of the modern epoch. Freedom from. The principles of the philosophy of liberalism and the very name liberalism are based on the thesis of freedom equals liberty. At the same time, the liberal philosophers, in particular Mill, underscore that the freedom they stand for is a strictly negative freedom. Moreover, they separate freedom from and freedom to and suggest using for these things two different English words, liberty and freedom. Liberty implies freedom from something. It is from here that the name liberalism is derived. Liberals fight for this freedom and insist on it. As for freedom to that is, the meaning and goal of freedom here liberals fall silent, reckoning that each individual can himself find a way to apply his freedom, or that he can neglect altogether to search for a way to use it. This is a question of private choice, which is not discussed and which has no political or ideological value. On the other hand, freedom from is defined precisely and has a dogmatic character. Liberals propose to be free from government and its control over the economy, politics, and civil society. Churches and their dogmas. Class systems. Any form of common areas of responsibility for the economy. Any attempt to redistribute, with one or another government or social institutions, the results of material and non-material labor, the formula of the liberal philosopher Philip Nemo, a follower of Hayek. Social justice is deeply immoral. Ethnic attachments. Any collective identity whatsoever. One can think that we have some version of anarchy here, but that is not exactly right. Anarchists, at least those like Proudhon, consider, as an alternative to government, free, communal labor, with a complete collectivization of its products, and they come out strongly against private ownership, while liberals, on the other hand, see in the market and in the sacredness of private property a pledge for the realization of their optimal socio-economic model. Besides, theoretically considering that the government must sooner or later die out, opening up a place for the world market and world civil society, liberals, for pragmatic reasons, support the government if it is bourgeois democratic, facilitates the development of the market, guarantees to civil society safety and protection against aggressive neighbors, and staves off the war of all against all, Hobbes. In everything else, liberals go rather far, repudiating practically all socio-political institutions, right up to the family and sexual differentiation. In extreme cases, liberals support not only the freedom of abortions, but even the freedom from sexual differentiation, supporting the rights of homosexuals, transsexuals, and so on. The family, as another form of society, is thought by them to be a purely contractual thing, which, as with other enterprises, is conditioned by legal agreements. On the whole, liberals insist not only on freedom from tradition and sacrality, not to mention previous forms of traditional society, but even on freedom from socialization and redistribution, on which leftist socialist and communist political ideologies insist, to speak of political forms that are contemporaries of liberalism or even pretenders to its throne. Liberalism and the nation. Liberalism was engendered in Western Europe and America in the epoch of bourgeois revolutions and strengthened as Western political, religious, and social institutions that preceded the imperial feudal periods gradually weakened, monarchy, the church, estates. In its first stages, liberalism dealt with the idea of the creation of contemporary nations, when in Europe they conceived the nation as a uniform political formation founded on a contractual basis, opposing the more ancient imperial and feudal forms. The nation was understood as the totality of citizens of a state, a totality in which is embodied the relationship of a population of individuals connected by a common territorial residence and a common level of economic development. Neither ethnic, nor religious, nor class factors had any significance. Such a nation-state, État-nation, had no common historical goal and no determinate mission. It conceived of itself as a corporation or business that is founded through the reciprocal agreement of its participants and that can theoretically be dissolved on those same bases. The European nations kicked religion, ethnic identity, and classes to the curb, believing these to be remnants of the Dark Ages. This is the difference between liberal nationalism and other versions thereof. Here, no values of ethno-religious or historical communities are taken into consideration. The accent is put only on the benefits and advantages of the collective agreement of the individuals concerned, who have established a government for concrete, pragmatic reasons. The challenge of Marxism. If, with the dismantling of feudal monarchic and clerical regimes, everything was going smoothly for liberalism, and no ideological alternatives stemming from the European Middle Ages were able to oppose liberals, then in the depths of the philosophy of the modern era there appeared a movement contesting with liberals for the right to first place in the process of modernization, and coming out with a powerful conceptual critique of liberalism derived not from positions of the past, from the right, but from positions of the future, the left. Such were socialist and communist ideas, receiving their most systematic expression in Marxism. Marx carefully analyzed the political economy of Adam Smith, and, more broadly, of the liberal school, but he drew from these ideas an absolutely original conclusion. He recognized their partial correctness in comparison to feudal models of traditional societies, but he offered to go further, and in the name of the future of mankind, to refute what are for liberals the most important postulates. In liberalism, Marxism denied the identification of the subject with the individual, thinking instead that the subject has a collective class nature. Recognized the unjust system of the appropriation of surplus value by capitalists in the process of a market economy. Reckoned the freedom of bourgeois society a veiled form of class supremacy, masking under new clothes the mechanisms of exploitation, alienation, and oppression. Called for a proletarian revolution and abolition of the market and private property. Pinned its hopes on aiming for the social collectivization of property, expropriation of the expropriator. Claimed creative labor as the social freedom of the communist future, as the realization of man's freedom to criticized bourgeois nationalism as a form of collective violence over the poorest layers of its respective societies, and as an instrument of international aggression in the name of the egoistic interests of the national bourgeoisie. Thus, over 2 centuries, Marxism transformed into the most important ideological opponent and competitor of liberalism, attacking its system and ideologically following and sometimes scoring important successes, especially in the 20th century, with the appearance of a world socialist system. At a certain point, it seemed as though precisely those leftist powers would win the argument over the heritage of modernity and for the orthodoxy of the New Age, and many liberals began to believe that socialism was the unavoidable future, which would correct the liberal political system and perhaps abolish it altogether. From here, the tendencies of social liberalism begin, which, recognizing certain moral theses of Marxism, strove to smooth over its revolutionary potential and to combine 2 foundational ideologies of the new era at the price of rejecting their cruelest and most pointed affirmations. Revisionists on the side of Marxism, in particular right-wing social democrats, moved in the same direction from the opposite camp. The question about how to relate to socialists and leftists reached its most difficult moments for liberals in the 1920s and 1930s. When the communists first proved the importance of their historical intentions and the possibility of their seizing and holding power. In this period, the neoliberal school arose, von Mises, Hayek, and a little later, Popper and Aron, formulating a very important ideological thesis: liberalism is not a transitional stage from feudalism to Marxism and socialism, but rather an ideology that is complete in itself, holding an exclusive monopoly on the heritage of the Enlightenment and the modern era. In this view, Marxism itself is no development of Western thought, but rather a regressive return, using modernist slogans, to the feudal epoch of eschatological uprisings and millenarian cults. Neoliberals proved this by the systematic critique of the German conservative philosopher Hegel, as well as by references to the totalitarian Soviet experience, and called for a return to the roots, to Locke and Smith, standing firmly on their principles, and by criticizing social liberals for their concessions and compromises. Neoliberalism as a theory was most clearly formulated in Europe, Austria, Germany, and Great Britain, but its large-scale realization happened in the United States, where liberalism dominated in politics, ideology, and economic practice. And although at the time of Roosevelt there were strong social liberal tendencies even in the USA, the New Deal era, the influence of Keynes, and so on, the indisputable advantage was with the liberal school. In a theoretical sense, this tendency received its greatest development in the Chicago School, M. Friedman, F. Knight, G. Simons, J. Stigler, and others. After the Second World War, the decisive stage of the battle for the heritage of the Enlightenment began. Liberals supported by the USA fought the final battle with Marxism, personified by the USSR and its allies. Europe occupied the 3rd place in the ideological war. Social liberal and social democratic tendencies prevailed there. The definitive victory of the liberals in the 1990s. The fall of the USSR and our defeat in the Cold War signified, from an ideological point of view, the final distribution of roles in the fight for the heritage of the Enlightenment and for the way of the future. Exactly on the strength of the fact that the USSR lost and fell apart, it became obvious that historical right was on the side of the liberals, especially of the neoliberals, who prevented socialism and communism from claiming the future as the progressive tomorrow. Soviet society and other socialist regimes turned out to be carefully disguised versions of archaic structures, having interpreted in their own way the mystically, religiously understood Marxism. This all-important moment in the political history of mankind first of all put the dot on the I with respect to the most important question of the times: which of the 2 central ideologies of the 20th century would follow the past, the spirit of the Enlightenment, and automatically receive the future, the right to dominate by ideological means, the coming days. The question of the goal of the historical process was principally settled. In the middle of the 20th century, the French philosopher, a Hegelian of Russian origin, Alexander Dugin, suggested that the Hegelian end of history would mark a communist world revolution. The traditionalists, René Guénon, Julius Evola, who rejected the Enlightenment, defending tradition and foretelling the end of the world through the victory of the fourth caste, the Shudras, or proletarians, thought similarly. But in 1991, with the dissolution of the USSR, it became clear that the end of history would carry not a Marxist, but a liberal form, about which the American philosopher Francis Fukuyama hurried to inform humanity, proclaiming the end of history as the planetary victory of the market, liberalism, the USA, and bourgeois democracy. Marxism as a possible alternative and project of the future became a meaningless episode of political and ideological history. From that moment, there not only began the takeoff of liberalism in its most orthodox, fundamentalist Anglo-Saxon and anti-socialist forms, but also the laying bare of the fundamental fact of the ideological history of man: liberalism is destiny. But this means that its theses, its philosophical, political, social, and economic principles and dogmas should be looked at as something universal and absolute, having no alternatives. On the threshold of the American century. As a result of the political history of the 20th century, it was discovered that liberalism had won the war for contemporary times, having beaten all its opponents on both the right and the left. The huge cycle of the modern era was completed with the triumph of liberal ideology, which received henceforth a monopoly on the control and direction of historical development. Liberalism was left with no symmetrical enemy, no large-scale subject with an adequate historical self-understanding, a convincing and orderly ideology, serious material and military resources, and comparable technological, economic, and armed forces. All that still opposed liberal ideology showed itself as a chaotic collection of simple nuisances and mistakes, in a word, noises, opposing through inertia the builders of the new liberal order. This was not a rivalry of alternative civilizational and geopolitical subjects, but the reactive and passive resistance of a disorganized field. Thus, soil, rain, karstic emptiness, or marshland bothers the builders of roads. The discussion is not about the construction of another route that another company insists on, but about the resistance of the environment. In this situation, the USA, as the citadel of world liberalism, took on a new quality. From this time on, it became not only one of two superpowers, but the single planetary hero, suddenly pulling away from its rivals. The French critic of the United States, Hubert Védrine, suggested that it should henceforth not be called a superpower, but a hyperpower, underscoring its solitariness and its asymmetrical superiority. From an ideological point of view, the victory of liberalism and the rise of the USA is not an accidental coincidence, but two sides of one and the same occurrence. The USA won the Cold War not because it amassed more potential and got ahead in the technological competition, but because it based itself on the liberal ideology, proving both its technological competence and its historical rightness in the ideological war, substantiating the balance of the modern era. And just as liberalism displayed its faded dimension, the USA received a concrete confirmation of its messianism, which, in the ideology of manifest destiny, was, since the 19th century, an article of faith for the American political elite. American neoconservatives recognized this arrangement of matters more clearly than anyone else. In the words of one of their most important ideologues, William Crystal, the 20th century was the century of America's rise, but the 21st century will be the American century. Let us consider that statement. What difference is there between the century of America and the American century? The century of America signifies that, in that period, the ideology of liberalism fought with its rivals, residual traditionalism, fascism, socialism, and communism, and smashed them to bits. America, having been one of a few world powers, transformed into the only one. And now, according to the thinking of the neoconservatives, America is due to affirm the American model, the American way of life, as a world order obligatory for all. Before one's eyes, the USA stopped being a national government and became a synonym for world government. The entire planet must henceforth become a world America, world government, or world state. This is what they call the American century, the project of globalizing the American model to global proportions. This is not simply colonization or a new form of imperialism, this is a program of the total implementation of the one and only ideological system copied from American liberal ideology. America henceforth has pretensions to the universal spreading of a unitary code, which penetrates into the life of peoples and governments in 1,000 different ways, like a global network through technology, the market economy, the political model of liberal democracy, information systems, the model of mass culture and its media products, and the establishment of direct strategic control of Americans and their satellites over geopolitical processes. The American century is thought of as a resmelting of the existing world order into a new one, built up on strictly American patterns. This process is conditionally called democratization, and it is directed at a few concrete geopolitical enclaves that are, in the first place, problematic from the point of view of liberalism. In this way, there came to be the projects of the Greater Middle East, Greater Central Asia, and so on. The meaning of them all consists in the uprooting of inertial national, political, economic, social, religious and cultural models and their replacement by the operational system of American liberalism. But it is not that important whether the discussion is about the enemies of the USA or their allies. Both friends and enemies are subject to reformatting, as are those who wish to remain neutral. This is the meaning of the American century. Liberalism, having defeated its formal enemies, penetrates completely. And now it is not enough to be on the side of the USA in local conflicts, as many countries behaved that were not liberal, those like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Henceforth, liberalism must penetrate into the depths of all societies and countries without exception, and the slightest resistance will be, according to the designs of the neoconservatives, broken, as happened in Serbia, Iraq and Afghanistan. American critics of such an approach, for instance, the paleoconservative Patrick Buchanan, declare, America acquired the whole world, but lost itself. However, this does not stop neoconservatives, inasmuch as they take the U.S. not only as a national government, but also as the avant-garde of the liberal ideology. And it was no accident that the neoconservatives emerged from Trotskyism. Just as Trotskyites sought a global communist revolution, mercilessly criticizing Stalin and the idea of building socialism in one country, contemporary neoconservatives call for a global liberal revolution, categorically rejecting the call of isolationists to limit themselves to the American borders and their historical allies. Precisely the neoconservatives, setting the tone for contemporary American politics, most deeply understand the ideological meaning of the fate of political teachings at the dawn of the 21st century. American neoconservative circles most adequately perceive the significance of the large-scale changes happening in the world. For them, ideology remains the most important subject of attention, although today it also turns into soft ideology or soft power. Liberalism and postmodernity. Having gone over from the formal opposition to the alternative ideologies to the new phase of introduction on the world scale, the liberal ideology changes its status. In the epoch of modernity, liberalism always coexisted with non-liberalism, which means that it was an object of choice, like with modern computer technology, where one can theoretically select a computer with a Microsoft, Mac OS or Linux operating system. After defeating its rivals, liberalism brought back a monopoly on ideological thinking. It became the sole ideology, not allowing any other alongside itself. One could say that it switched over from the level of a program to the level of an operating system, having become something common. Notice, coming to a store and selecting a computer, we more often than not do not say, "Give me a computer that runs Microsoft." We simply say, "Give me a computer." And in accordance with our silence, we are sold a computer with a Microsoft operating system. So it is with liberalism, it is implanted in us by itself, like something standard, which it would be absurd and pointless to contest. The content of liberalism changes, switching over from the level of expression to the level of speech. Liberalism becomes not proper liberalism but subaudition, silent agreement, consensus. This corresponds to the switchover from the epoch of modernity to postmodernity. In postmodernity, liberalism, preserving and even increasing its influence, ever more rarely projects an intelligent and freely adopted political philosophy. It becomes unconscious, self-understood, and instinctive. This instinctive liberalism, having pretenses to transform itself into the generally non-conscious matrix of contemporariness, gradually acquires grotesque characteristics. From the classical principles of liberalism, which have become unconscious, the world reserve unconscious could be used as an analogy alongside the dollar as the world reserve currency. The grotesque ways of postmodern culture are born. This is already a sui generis post-liberalism, following from the total victory of classical liberalism, but leading it to extreme conclusions. Thus there arises the panorama of post-liberal grotesques. The measure of things becomes not the individual, but the post-individual, the dividual, accidentally playing an ironic combination of parts of people, his organs, his clones, his simulacra, all the way up to cyborgs and mutants. Private property is idolized, transcendentalized, and transforms from that which a man owns to that which owns the man. Equality of opportunity turns into equality of the contemplation of opportunities, the society of the spectacle guy Debord. Belief in the contractual character of all political and social institutions grows into an equalization of the real and the virtual, and the world becomes a technical model. All forms of non-individual authorities disappear altogether, and any individual is free to think about the world howsoever he sees fit, the crisis of common rationality. The principle of the separation of powers transforms into the idea of a constant electronic referendum, a sort of electronic parliament, where each internet user continually votes on any decision by giving his opinion in any number of forums, which in turn cedes power to each individual citizen, each becoming, in effect, his own branch of government. Civil society completely displaces government and converts into a global, cosmopolitan melting pot. From the thesis economy is destiny, it takes up the thesis the numerical code that is destiny. So far as work, money, the market, production, consumption, everything becomes virtual. Some liberals and neoconservatives were terrified at that prospect, which opened up as a consequence of the ideological victory of liberalism, before the transition to post-liberalism and postmodernity. Thus, Fukuyama, the author of the thesis of the liberal end of history in the last decade, has called on the US and the West to turn back and to hold over the previous phase of vintage classical liberalism, with the market, the nation-state, and its customary scientific rationalism, in order to avoid sliding into the post-liberal chasm. But in this, he is contradicting himself. The logic of the transformation from normal liberalism to the liberalism of postmodernity is neither arbitrary nor voluntary. It is written in the very structure of the liberal ideology. In the course of the gradual liberation of man from all that which is not himself, from all non-human and supra-individual values and ideals, one must sooner or later free a man from his own self. And the most frightening crisis of the individual does not begin when he is fighting alternative ideologies that deny man is the highest value, but when he attains his conclusive and irreversible victory. Liberalism in contemporary Russia. If we were to juxtapose all the aforementioned about liberalism with what is understood by liberalism in Russia, we would have to admit that there is no liberalism here. There are liberals, but no liberalism. Until the beginning of the 1990s, Marxist ideology formally dominated in Russia, and raised up from childhood the outright majority of those people who, in one way or another, influence the decisions of government today. The principles of liberalism, in the first place, were foreign to the instinctive foundations of Russian society. They were severely persecuted by the ideological organs in the USSR, and were either unknown or else construed in a caricatured and fragmentary way. The sole meaning of liberalism in Russia in the 1990s was freedom from Russian Soviet political economic traditions and an uncritical, ignorant, and parodic imitation of the West. Practically none of the post-Soviet elite selected liberalism consciously and deliberately. Until the last moment of the fall of the USSR, the leaders of Russian liberalism eulogized the Communist Party, the ideas of Marx, the plan and socialism, while the oligarchs made a living in the Committee of Komsomols or served in the KGB. Liberalism as a political ideology interested no one, not a penny was paid for it. Such a cheap and crooked liberalism was maintained in the 1990s as an ersatz ideology for post-Soviet Russia. But instead of mastering liberal principles, its supporters and preachers engaged in careerism, privatization, and setting up their own little deals, in the best case fulfilling the guidelines of the Western curators of the breakdown of the Soviet and Russian state. This was an ideological disintegration of the previous structure without erecting anything new in its place at all. No one even really chose the dubious freedom from. When Putin came to power and attempted to turn the process of Russia's disintegration around, he encountered, to a large measure, no ideological opposition. He was challenged by concrete economic clans, whose interests he discerned, and the more active agency of influence, deeply entrenched in espionage in the service of the West. The absolute majority of liberals quickly transformed themselves into backers of Putin, adapting themselves under the individual patriotic sympathies of the new leader. Even iconic figures of Russian liberalism, Gaidar, Chubais, etc., behaved like banal opportunists. They could not care less about the ideological content of Putin's reforms. In Russia, irrespective of the whole period of the 1990s, liberalism did not penetrate deeply, and did not spawn a political generation of authentic, convinced liberals. It operated on Russia mainly from without, which led in the end to a worsening of relations with the US, to the obstruction of Putin and his course in the West, and, in response, to his Munich speech. But insofar as the number of conscious liberals during the critical moment of change in Russia turned out to be not more than the number of conscious communists at the end of the 1980s, Putin did not insist on their ideological harassment, opting to control only the more unbridled of the liberal oligarchs and the direct agents of influence who became impudent through lawlessness. Intuitively striving to preserve and consolidate Russian sovereignty, Putin entered into a conflict with the liberal West and its plans for globalization, but without forming his actions into an alternative ideology. This was mostly because there were so very few convinced liberals in Russia. The real liberal is the one who acts in compliance with the fundamental principles of liberalism, including in those instances when to do so could lead to serious consequences, repressions, and even deprivation of life. If people turn out to be liberals only when liberalism is permitted, in fashion or even out of obligation, ready at the first difficulty to repudiate these principles, such liberalism has no relation to the real kind. It seems Khodorkovsky, the icon of contemporary Russian liberals, understood that, having spent some time in prison. But in this, it seems to me, he is an exception among the liberals who remain free. The crusade against the West. However much liberalism today claims that there are no alternatives, there is always a choice in human history. While man exists, he is free to choose, both what everyone chooses and what no one does. Liberalism, and by the way, the US and the West, today does not offer itself up as an option among many to prefer, it calls this decision the only one possible. And this is not a usual arbitrariness. The logic of the political history of modernity avows the validity of such an approach. Of course, one could imagine that many people on the planet came late to the awareness of what happened at the end of the 20th and the start of the 21st century, and by inertia believe in socialism, communism, and even religion. Or maybe that someone does not accept liberalism for some other local or individual consideration, for instance, after realizing that, in such a system, he would find himself among losers. But this does not matter much. All systematic and foundational alternatives are crushed, and someone's peripheral, troubled, and unintelligent dissatisfaction, plainly, in political ideological terms, affects nothing. Nevertheless, even in the new phase of its self-evident imposition, liberalism and post-liberalism may, and must, I believe this, be repudiated. And if behind it there stands the full might of the inertia of modernity, the spirit of the Enlightenment and the logic of the political and economic history of European humanity of the last centuries, it must be repudiated together with modernity, the Enlightenment, and European humanity altogether. Moreover, only the acknowledgement of liberalism as fate, as a fundamental influence, comprising the march of Western European history, will allow us really to say no to liberalism. We should repudiate it in its capacity as a global metaphysical factor, and not as a particular, accidental heresy, or as a distortion of normal development. The path that humanity entered upon in the modern era led precisely to liberalism and to the repudiation of God, tradition, community, ethnicity, empires, and kingdoms. Such a path is tread entirely logically, having decided to liberate itself from everything that keeps man in check. The man of the modern era reached his logical apogee. Before our eyes he is liberated from himself. The logic of world liberalism and globalization pulls us into the abyss of postmodern dissolution and virtuality. Our youth already have one foot in it. The codes of liberal globalism are effectively introduced on an unconscious level through habits, commercials, glamour, technology, the media, celebrities. The usual phenomenon now is the loss of identity, and already not simply only national or cultural identity, but even sexual and soon enough even human identity. And defenders of human rights, not noticing the tragedy of the entire peoples that they sacrifice to their cruel plan of the New World Order, will howl tomorrow about transgressions against the rights of cyborgs or clones. The people's refusal to adopt liberalism is completely understandable, and can be met at every turn. But it will remain impotent and ineffective until we recognize that we are dealing not with an accident, but with something systemic, not with a temporary deviation from the norm, but with a fatal, incurable disease, the origins of which we should seek in those periods in which to many everything seemed unclouded and clear, and humanity seemed to enter into the epoch of progress, development, freedom, and equal rights. But this was simply a syndrome of approaching agony. Liberalism is an absolute evil, not only in its factual embodiment, but also in its fundamental theoretical presuppositions. And its victory, its world triumph, only underscores and displays those most wicked qualities which earlier were veiled. Freedom from is the most disgusting formula of slavery, inasmuch as it tempts man to an insurrection against God, against traditional values, against the moral and spiritual foundations of his people and his culture. And even if liberalism won all the formal battles and brought us indeed to the cusp of an American century, the real battle is still ahead. But it takes place only after the authentic meaning of the past will be genuinely understood, when the metaphysical meaning of liberalism and its fateful victory becomes known in the right measure and the right proportions. Only tearing it out by its roots can defeat this evil, and I do not exclude that such a victory will necessitate erasing from the face of the earth those spiritual and physical halos from which arose the global heresy, which insists that man is the measure of all things. Only a global crusade against the US, the West, globalization, and their political ideological expression, liberalism, is capable of becoming an adequate response. The elaboration of the ideology of this crusader campaign, undoubtedly, is a matter for Russia not to pursue alone, but together with all the world powers who, in one way or another, oppose the American century. Nevertheless, in any case, this ideology must begin with the recognition of the fatal role of liberalism, which has characterized the path of the West from the moment when it rejected the values of God and tradition. 10. The ontology of the future. Is there a future? The question is legitimate because it provokes thinking about the ontology of time. What is, or at least, is now? Precisely because of the fact of its being now, it is considered as being proper according to the multitude of our direct, empirical perceptions. What was, or the facts of that which has existed previously, is certified by the historical record and other remnants. But in both cases, forgery or misunderstanding is possible. Therefore, the existence of what has yet to be is highly questionable, at best. Martin Heidegger spoke about three ecstasies of time: the past, the present, and the future. Apparently, there are three ontological arguments relative to these three ecstasies. Immediacy, there is not, is related to the present. Documentary, there was not, is related to the past. And probabilistic, there will be there will not be, is related to the future. It seems that we could create a hierarchy based on the evidence. There is, there was, there will be. There is most evident. There will be is most doubtful. There was is in the middle. The future is the most unreliable among the three ecstasies of time. The future cannot be taken into consideration to the same degree as there is or there was. There was, or at least we believe that it was from the evidence at hand. Concerning the future, you cannot know for certain. A given event or thing could happen, but most likely will not. Thus, the future lacks being compared with the other ecstasies of time. From this point, we could proceed in several different directions. For example, we could question the solidity of ontological arguments concerning the most evident moment, the present. This recalls Kant and his doubts about the inner being of the object. The fact of simply perceiving something is not enough for a definitive declaration of its being. This is the Ding in sich, the thing in itself, conundrum of Kantian philosophy. Not pure reason, but only practical reason gives being to an object, based on the moral imperative. An object should have being. It would be good for it to have it. Therefore, it has to have it. If the being of the present, as the most evident of all the moments of time, can be seriously put in doubt, then we are arriving at an interesting point. All three moments of time are then ontologically unprovable and unverifiable and concern only the gnoseologic level, relating to the philosophy of knowledge and the human faculty for learning. This is pessimistic concerning the present, whose reality we habitually take for granted, but is optimistic concerning the two other moments, the past and the future. The past and the future thereby acquire equal consideration with the present. From the perspective of pure reason, the present, past and future all have equal phenomenological value. The future in this case is the phenomenon and hence, phenomenologically speaking, it is. Being the phenomenon itself, the future is and it is real. The future, therefore, is actual. Kant, analyzing the a priori forms of sensibility, puts time nearer to the subject, and space nearer to the object. It indicates that time belongs closest to the orbit of the subject. Time is hence subjective. It is the transcendental subject that installs time in the perception of the object. Now let us change perspective and consider time phenomenologically. Husserl proposed to study time through the use of music. The consciousness of hearing the music is not based on the strict identification of notes sounding in a concrete, discrete moment. Hearing music is something different from hearing an individual note that sounds now, in the present. The consciousness of music occurs by hearing an individual note that sounds now, in the present, as well as recalling the past notes that are dissolving little by little into nothingness. However, their resonance persists in the consciousness and gives music its aesthetic sense. Husserl calls it the continuous instance. The past is present in the present. The present thus becomes continuous and includes the past as a vanishing presence. This is the methodological key for the understanding of history. History is awareness of the presence of the past in the present. The vanishing events continue to sound in the active recalling of them. Clio and Polyhymnia, the muses of history and time respectively in Greek mythology, are sisters. This recalling is necessary to give us our sense of the present. The anamnesis of Plato has the same function. The soul should recall the hidden past of its previous lives in order to reconstruct the wholeness of the melody of destiny. Only thus could it be played harmoniously. The future should, therefore, be understood in this context. The future is continuous in the present. Not the moment of novum, but the process of the fading of the present into the past. The future is the tail end of the present, its resonance. We live the future just now, and already now, when we play the note of the melody of life. The future is the process of the death of the present, attention to the dissolution of melody into the totality of harmony. The novum appears in the future only when the harmony is lost, when our attention falls asleep, and then suddenly we awaken and cannot identify the sounds that we hear. Momentarily, they simply make no sense. That is the novum, spontaneous incomprehension of what is going on in the ecstasy of time. It is the nature of discrete, discontinuous events. It is the suspended moment of being without history, and hence without a sense of awareness and consciousness. Edmund Husserl dug much deeper into the phenomenology of time. He discovered the new instance of consciousness lying underneath the level where the nature of time, as illuminated by music, is perceived. According to Husserl, beneath this level there is another, ultimate one, which is responsible for our perception of what is now with the force of evidence, and a much more intensive taste of reality that recalls the ever-dying past. This instance is consciousness itself, the consciousness as such that precedes the intentionality and the dualist nature of apprehension, being necessarily divided into two parts: the perceived and the perceiving. In the present, the consciousness perceives itself and nothing else. That is the ultimate experience of the last source of reality. According to Husserl, the foundation of all consciousness is transcendental subjectivity, from whence it conceives itself as a kind of short circuit. This experience is self-referential. In it, there is the perception of pure being as the presence of the subjectivity of consciousness. This short circuit causes all kinds of dualities to be born, the logical ones and the temporal ones. The necessity of stopping this trauma is manifest in the creation of time, the articulation of the three moments of time. Consciousness of time is necessary to hide the present, which is the traumatic experience of the self-referential nature of pure consciousness. Intentionality and logical judgments are all rooted in this evasion of the perception of the pain of the void whereby consciousness becomes aware of itself. Such an attitude to the levels of consciousness explains the origin of time as the evasion of the present and the unbearable tension of the pure presence of the same. This tension is immediately relieved by the expansion of all the imaginable types of dualities that constitute the textures of the continuous process of time. The model of this process is the creation of the three moments of time. The logical and spatial symmetries follow such dualities as yes/no, true/false, high/low, right/left, here/there, and so on. Before/after belongs to the same cadence. Time constitutes consciousness running from the unbearable confrontation with itself. But this confrontation is inevitable, so the present, and the high precision of its existential perception, is born. What is most important in this interpretation of the morphology of time? The idea that time precedes the object, and that in the construction of time we should seek an inner depth of consciousness, rather than a consciousness rooted in outer phenomena constituted by the subjective process of traumatic self-awareness. The world around us becomes what it is by the fundamental action of presencing accomplished by the mind. When the mind sleeps, reality lacks the sense of present existence. It is fully immersed in a continuous dream. The world is created by time, and time, in its turn, is the manifestation of self-aware subjectivity and intrasubjectivity. These remarks lead us to considerations of the future prognostication, projection, and analysis of the future. Moving from man to society, and from anthropology to sociology, we can affirm the future as something absolutely subjective in nature, and so, in this context, it is something social. The future is social because it is a historical feature and not immanent to an object's nature. The object has no future. The earth, animals, stones, machines all have no future. Only that which is included in the human social context can take part in the future, and then only indirectly. Without self-referential consciousness, there can be no time. Time is that which is inside us, and what makes us who we are. Time is man's ultimate identity. This subjectivity of time does not mean that prognostication will be self-fulfilling prophecy, as per Robert K. Merton, nor that any event is realizable a priori. The future is strictly determined, not something voluntary. Time, being historical, is predefined precisely by its historical content. The subject is not free from its structure, and more than this, it is absolutely enslaved by it. Time needs the future as a void for the continuous fading of the present and, partially, of the past. Without the future, the subject will not have the space necessary to evade, running from the impossible encounter with itself, from the short circuit mentioned above. The frozen moment of the present without the future is that of death. Society needs the future to run from itself further and further. The chronicle of such a run is the sense of history. Society requires a narrative of the past. The future is predefined by the structure of the subject. That is why the future is strictly defined. The subject cannot stop itself from deploying the chains of reason, it cannot not think, and cannot constitute the temporal cadences. The future is in the same measure as the present and past. Where time is, the future is also. The future makes sense. It makes sense even before it happens. More than this, the future makes sense even if it will never happen. In this lies the semantic value of prophecy and prognosis. Even if it does not occur, it is also pregnant with meaning and helps explain the present. Prophecies and prognosis, further, help us to discern the meaning of the future. When the future refutes the expectations of prophecy and prognosis, the fact of their refutation gives sense to the future, because our understanding of it consists, in part, in what was not realized. Unfulfilled prophecy has exactly the same importance as fulfilled prophecy. The future can be analyzed with the same accuracy as the present and the past. The only unique features of the future are the flash of the encounter of the deepest consciousness with itself, and the intensive shock that results from a conscious understanding of the present for what it is. What the present is the note that sounds now. But it is not music, and can be analyzed. The isolated note says nothing. It conveys nothing to us. It is understandable only by taking into consideration and in the context of the other notes of the particular piece of music. The context gives it sense. So, in the content of time, it is something whole that is disposed a priori in the three moments of time. We experience time in its totality. Therefore, the future is already laid out with the sense of music. History is not only our memory of the past. It is also the explication of the present and the experience of the future. When we understand history and its logic well, we can easily guess what will follow, what is going to happen, and which note should come next. Knowing society, we could identify in its history the harmony, the periods, the refrains, and the structure of the piece. Of course, we could encounter surprises, but most surprising would be the possibility of one authentic moment of experiencing the self-knowledge of pure consciousness. It is possible to be awoken by the strength of this inner light of self-reflection. In this traumatic situation, we discover our identity between the most inner and outer levels of our consciousness. We live in the creation of the external world by the internal self. But that is no longer history, it is breaking through history, an intrusion to the center of time, where time is eternally being constructed. Time springs from this point. There it exists in the undifferentiated unity of all three ecstasies past, present, and future. Time can be constructed and organized in different ways. The past can be connected with the present and with the future by different links. This circular time is based on an eternal refrain pattern. In the center of circular time, there is the experience of consciousness linked to itself in the manner of a short circuit. The power of this trauma rejects our awareness of life and banishes it to the periphery, where it becomes circular time, where the future becomes the past, and so on, for eternity. It is the eternal return of the same. Time can be organized as a regressive line, traditional time. Here the experience of the short circuit is placed in the past. The ear tries to capture the distant sounds of the past and truly reproduce it. In traditional society, time is based on the everlasting effort of Platonic anamnesis. Most important here is memory and transmission. In this organization of time, the future and the present are constructed by the past. Reality and actuality regress into the past and are consigned to memory. Time can also be constructed as the perpetual state of waiting for the future. This is chiliastic or messianic time. Here, the short-circuit experience is projected into the future. History is going to fulfill itself in the future, where the ultimate nature of reality lies. This organization of time is centered on that which is to come. Tomorrow is the focus of the historical sense. Being is oriented to future life. There is another construction of time installed in the object, which is moved to the extreme periphery of the subject, where the objective world is fixed. This organization of time is material time, time introduced in the substance of the physical world. This is the time of slaughter, of the death of the subject. Consciousness can construct different forms of time and their combinations. Before creating the world filled with forms, the subject creates the form of time where the world is to be. The histories of different societies are different. Different too are the pieces, the musicians, the composers, the instruments, the musical genre, and the types of notation used by them. That is why humanity as a whole cannot have a future. It has no future. To speak of the future of humanity is quite senseless, because it completely lacks semantic value, as well as the sense of these different societal constructions of history and time. Every society is a separate act of consciousness, expanded in the rational and temporal horizons. All are unique and open. But before coming to an understanding of the history of a given society, we should immerse ourselves in the depths of its identity. The fact that every people, every culture, every society has its own history, makes time a local phenomenon grounded in geography. Every society possesses its own temporality. For a given society, all the moments of time are different: past, present, and future. Societies can cross and intersect, cross-pollinate and interact. Their sense of history, however, cannot. History is local. A shared sense of history is possible only on the basis of the domination of one society over another, and imposing its own history and, thus, its identity on the enslaved one. That means if a given society is to have a future, it must be its own future. Its future is formed through a pertinence to the expanding forces of the constituent subject. A society is united through the structures of the collective consciousness of the individuals that comprise it. It means we should unite the semantic ranges of our respective pasts. Further, it means that in order to prove the harmonious correspondences of the notes and melodies of our own particular musical piece, the symphonic nature of a given society must be realized. The past is fading, but never extinguished. If the past were extinguished, the present would lose its sense and the future the possibility of occurring. The fading of the past is an essential characteristic of time. The fading of the past is necessary for the morphology of time at the same level as the flash of the present and the vagueness of the future. Therefore, the members of a society should ask themselves today about their future. If they have a history, they could have a future. If they have both a history and a future, they are. If they are, the future is implicit now in the present. The future is being made now. On this basis, we can establish both prognosis and projection. According to Heidegger, thrownness, Geworfenheit, is a concept that describes the interactions of the subject with its surroundings in everyday life that cause it to act upon instincts, form immediate reactions to other people's language and actions, flow with the situation, and make immediate interpretations. Being thrown into a situation without being able to reflect on it first, and therefore not acting, is also an action, for reflection on the situation, i.e., not acting, is also something that can be interpreted as an action. One therefore must rely on instinctual interpretations and go with the flow. The thrownness of the subject, Dasein, forces it to project itself into the future. Etymologically, it is clear. The subject is formed by subjectum, subjacere, projection by projectum, projacere. In both cases we have the Latin verb to throw. The analysis of the future is rooted in this. By apprehending the future, we are making it. Therefore, any consideration of the future is to work on history and the consciousness of time as such. It is doubtful that one society is capable of comprehending another society at the same level as it is comprehended by its own members. Such a possibility presupposes the existence of the meta-society, the society God, which could operate with the ultimate depths of consciousness in the same manner as consciousness operates with awareness, noesis, intentionality, logic, time, and finally with the world. Obviously, Western society is particularly afflicted with such an ethnocentric approach and universal pretensions rooted in its racist and colonialist past. But in the 20th century, this was proven to be completely unfounded and false. Structuralists, sociologists, cultural anthropologists, postmodernists, phenomenologists, linguists, existentialists, and so on, have all deployed convincing arguments demonstrating that the inner nature of such an attitude is rooted in the will to power and paranoid imposition of one's own identity on the other. This illness is called Western racism. The West is a local and historical phenomenon. It is a very acute civilization, very particular, very arrogant, and very smart. But it is just one civilization among many others. The West has history, and is because of its history. The attempt to abdicate this history in favor of pure universalism and in favor of metaculture and metalanguage is doomed. There are two possible outcomes of this. 1. Either the West will lose its own identity and will turn into an automaton. 2. Or it will try to impose its own history, conceived by itself as being universal, on all the other existing civilizations, destroying them in the process, and creating a new kind of global concentration camp for their cultures. The first outcome implies a struggle of automatons with humanity. The second implies an inevitable global liberation movement struggling against this neo-imperialism. It is for the West to decide how to manage the consequences of its proper history and its implications. The West can try to close its history, but it is unlikely that it will succeed in closing the history of all the others. Now is the moment to begin the fight for the historical being of societies. This historical being is time, the sense of which is constituted subjectively. This sense can reside only in a given society itself. Time is socially and subjectively constructed. The West cannot intersect with the sense of non-Western societies. The non-Western societies, i.e. the rest, cannot correctly understand the West and its values. They are in continuous error thinking that they can. It is false. They cannot. But, likewise, Western people cannot understand the rest. The structures of the subjects, its sense of time, and its music are all different. The past, the present, and the future of historical societies cannot be exposed by any metaculture. They are lying too deep, and are defended from foreign eyes by the destructive might of the self-referential moment, by the shock of this great tension. What for the West is, for the other cultures is not. So, we are dealing with different conceptions of time and with different futures. At last, we have come to the end of history and globalization. The end of history is the logical conclusion of universalism. The end of history is the abolition of the future. History proceeds and reaches its terminal state. There is no more space to go on. By abolishing the future, the entire structure of time, such as the past and the present, are also abolished. How can this be possible? We could compare it to the simultaneous playing of all existing notes, sounds, and melodies of a musical piece, resulting in a cacophony, the gnashing and grinding of teeth. At the same time, it will provoke absolute silence, deafness, and sourness. Hence, there will be no space for the temporalization of the inner tension of transcendental subjectivity. The short circuit would grow exponentially without the possibility of being dissipated. That means the igniting of a conflagration, the same fire that usually goes hand in hand with the sword. In order to prevent the blaze and the clashing of swords that would result from closing the temporal and logical relief valve, the world will strive to trap consciousness in networks and virtuality, where it can run away from the inner pressure of self-awareness without issue. If it succeeds, the new world of the machine kingdom will be created. The global networks and cyberspace are suitable only for the existence of post-humans, post-society, and post-culture. Instead of fire, we will get lightning and electricity. Some people believe Fukuyama is already a robot. Globalization is equivalent to the end of history. Both go hand in hand. They are semantically linked. Different societies have different histories. That means different futures. If we going to make a tomorrow common to all societies existing on the planet, if we are going to propose a global future, then we need first to destroy the history of those other societies, to delete their pasts, to annihilate the continuous moment of the present, virtualizing the realities that are constructed by the content of historical time. A common future means the deletion of particular histories. But this means that no histories at all, including their futures, will exist. The common future is no future. Globalization is the death of time. Globalization cancels out the transcendental subjectivity of Husserl or the Dasein of Heidegger. There would be neither any more time nor being. We must deal with the bifurcation of temporal constructions. It is time to address this question with all its implicit weight. Now, on the eve of the end of history, the edge of the descent into post-history, we could make the decision to give different ontological responses. When we construct the future, it should not be global in scope. It cannot be just one future, we must have many futures. The transcendental subjectivities, cultures, and societies can preserve space for the scattering of energies born of the encounter with oneself, the short circuit in question through its temporalization, that will grant the existence of the outer world and the continuing of, always and necessarily, local histories. Time will continue, and the world as the experience of real presencing will be supported by the structure of the deep subjectivity. History will remain local. The common history must be a symphony of the different music of local histories being created by the unique chronological rhythms of times, and not one part attempting to drown out and overwhelm the rest until it is the only sound that can be heard. The next question is, does the formalization of the nation-state correctly and exhaustively reflect the structure of the transcendental subject as the creator of history? Will future historical time necessarily be national, as constructed by modernity, or will it be expressed in other ways? Maybe it will return to pre-modern forms? When Huntington evokes civilizations, he admits the possibility of emergent localities and local identities being different from the existing, manufactured, nation-states. Civilizations are cultural and religious communities, not ethnic national ones. We could imagine a step backward, in the pre-national direction, Islamic integration, or a step forward in the post-national direction, the European Union or Eurasian Union, or we could tolerate other civilizations in the form of nation-states. The historical narratives and the way in which politics formalizes time could be changed. It means there is a lot of work that should be done, historically speaking. While someone is alive, he can change not only the future but also the past. The gesture or meaningful action accomplished in the present will add a new sense to the past. Only after death does one's past become the property of another. Hence, the history of peoples, societies, and cultures is open. They have the possibility to make the amazing turn that is necessary to view their past from a new perspective. So, history is music and the work of muses. Are civilizations destined to clash with each other? It is not written in stone, history lacks linear rules. Difference does not automatically necessitate clash and struggle. Of course, history knows war. But history knows peace as well. War and peace have always existed. War and peace will always be. They serve to relieve the tension and the stress of the present. They liberate and subjugate horror and death. Total war and total peace are equally murderous. The continuation of the history of local societies, instead of a single historical narrative, will lead to the preservation of being, and hence to the possibility for the future to happen. The second option is globalization. It cancels the future. It requires the arrival of post-humanity. It constructs the post-world consisting of simulacra and virtual structures. In place of the transcendental subject, Dasein, society becomes a huge computer center, a matrix, a supercomputer. In place of time, it creates simulacrums of the past, present, and future. The simulacrum of the past is false memory, the product of artificial influence rewriting historical memory. The walling off of the transcendental subject allows the past to be changed as if it were a pirated DVD. An alternate version of society could be loaded as a prequel. Such a substitution of the past is technically possible. Sufficient control over the present allows the past to be easily rewritten. The substitution of the future follows from this manipulation. Two disparate tracks mixed and played over each other produce cacophonic repercussions in the future. The future is petrified, and the semantics of time blur, fork, and multiply. Manipulating the present is a little more complicated and requires a higher degree of sophistication. To remove the present, the transcendental subjectivity must not only be walled off, but eradicated. This presumes the transition from the human to the post-human. Developments in the Human Genome Project, cloning, advances in robots, and new generations of cyborg all brings us close to the advent of post-humanity. The goal of this process is to produce creatures that will lack an existential dimension with zero subjectivity. Simulacrums can be made not only out of reason, but also from unconsciousness. The most important facet of this process is the abolition of the present. Such post-human creatures and inanimate objects, animals, vehicles, plants, stones, and so on have no sense of the present. If globalization continues, what is the fate of subjectivity? What is the ontology of the future that will probably never happen? A fairly unorthodox theory could be suggested. Let us assume that multipolarity is stillborn, that history has ended, and that the project of globalization has become a reality. How will the final exorcism of transcendental subjectivity be performed? How will the final decision concerning the abolition of Dasein be implemented? After all, as long as mankind and societies exist, they should make this decision for themselves. It is impossible to make an appeal to the other which could be blamed or praised for the decision and its result. Such a reference to the other is acceptable only when the self and the other are one and the same. If we lose our identity, we will also lose alterity, the capacity for otherness, and thus the ability to distinguish between self and not self, and consequently to assume the existence of any alternative viewpoint. So we are the authors of the end of history which concerns ourselves and no one else. Thus, having excluded the presence of the other, an explanation is still required about how man can accomplish the last gesture of self-destruction. How can he transfer the initiatives of existence to the post-human world, a world that will disappear immediately upon the expiration of the last man, for there will be no one left to bear witness? This is a great problem, and it requires an even deeper insight into the structure of the transcendental subject that generates time and its formulations. Nobody else can make decisions about how to reset time or to end it, an end that can only be brought about by ourselves through a final self-immolation by the exaltation of the short circuit. Hence, the subject carries within itself the possibility of such a chronicide. Globalization and the end of history cannot be reduced to the will of someone other than he who is the source of the creation of time, at least not within the limits of immanent philosophy. Consequently, this can mean only one thing: that within the depths of transcendental subjectivity, there lies another layer which Husserl had not uncovered. Husserl was convinced that the layer he discovered was the last one. But it turns out that this is not so. There has to be another dimension yet to be found, the most hidden one. We can designate it as the radical subject. If Husserl's transcendental subjectivity constitutes reality through the experience of a manifestation of self-awareness, the radical subject is to be found, not on the way out, but on the way in. It shows itself only in the moment of ultimate historic catastrophe, in the traumatic experience of the short circuit which is stronger, and lasts for a moment longer than it is possible to endure. The same experience that makes the transcendental subjectivity manifest itself and deploy its content, thus creating time with its intrinsic music, is regarded by the radical subject as an invitation to reveal itself in another manner on the other side of time. For the radical subject, time in all its forms and configurations is nothing more than a trap, a trick, a decoy delaying the real decision. For the radical subject, it is not only virtuality and the electronic networks which are the prison, but reality itself has already become so, a concentration camp, an agony, and a torture. The slumber of history is something contrary to the condition where the radical subject could exist, complete itself, and become. The creation of subjectivity, being the secondary formation of temporality, is an obstacle for its realization. If we accept the hypothesis of the radical subject, we immediately confront an instance that explains who has made the decision in favor of globalization, the suicide of humanity, and the end of history, who has conceived this plan and made it reality. It can therefore only be the drastic gesture of the radical subject, looking for liberation from time through the construction of non-temporal, impossible reality. The radical subject is incompatible with all kinds of time. It vehemently demands anti-time, based on the exalted fire of eternity transfigured in the radical light. When everybody has gone, the only thing that remains is those who cannot be gone. Perhaps that is the reason for this greatest of all probations. 11. The new political anthropology, the political man and his mutations. Man as a function of politics. What man is derived not from himself as an individual, but from politics. It is politics, being the dispositive of violence and legitimate power, that defines the man. It is the political system that gives us our shape. Moreover, the political system has an intellectual and conceptual power, as well as a transformative potential without limitations. The answer to the anthropological question rests on the configuration of power in society. Power itself consists of two elements. First is the power to shape the paradigm integrated in society through state institutions, and second is power as the dispositive of violence, which serves as a means to integrate the paradigm into the society. Consequently, the single, highest authority of power and its structure controls our political concept of man in a given society. The sphere of political anthropology emerges here, the study of the political concept of man. But there is also the concept of the political man. The difference between these two categories is that the political concept of man is the concept of the man as such, which is installed in us by the state or the political system. The political man is a particular means of correlating man with this state and political system. At first, the state or the political system installs this concept in us, and then it both grants and takes away our rights. However, on the preconceptional level, on the level of political anthropology, it falls to us to give, or to take away, our own rights and to add, or remove, a political status. We believe that we are causa sui, generated within ourselves, and only then do we find ourselves in the sphere of politics. In fact, it is politics that constitutes us. Whether we are born in a maternity hospital or in an open field, whether we are carried into a ward with electricity or a dark, smoky hut depends on politics. Politics grants us our political status, our name, and our anthropological structure. Man's anthropological structure shifts when one political system changes to another. Consequently, the political man and our political anthropology alike are given different shapes after the conversion from traditional to modern society. If we remain within the bounds of conventional political anthropological structures, which were described in great detail in my book, The Philosophy of Politics, we may stress two notions. First, we can say, look how tremendous the shift in the political anthropology is, that resulted from the conversion of the traditional state to the modern state. We may be astonished by it, we may be amazed at how it is not only the political institutions, but also man himself that is transformed on the most fundamental level. But later, we inevitably encounter the fact that, right now, we are in the state of shifting from the political mode of modernity to postmodernity, and we realize that a completely new view surrounds us. It becomes clear, from our perspective, that the parameters of both the traditional and modern society flow one into the other. In fact, Homo politicus, the political man, was postulated in both of these paradigms. Of course, on the pole of modernity, we have the rational, autonomous individual, and we have a particle of a certain holistic ensemble on the other pole. As for postmodernity, it declares that there are no differences as such between these two types of society, politics, and concepts of man. It matters not whether this very man is constituted according to the liberal, individualist approach or by the holistic eidos, it is man which is the outcome. The boundaries of post-anthropology and the origin of post-politics. At this stage, we are able to single out completely new symptoms of the type of man constituted by the politics of postmodernity, depoliticization, autonomization, microscopization, and sub- and transhumanization. That is, today man is not regarded as a whole, his parts are considered to be independent. It is his desires, emotions, moods, and inclinations that matter. At the same time, while on the one hand attention is transferred from the individual to the sub-individual level, on the other hand, the sub-individual level merges with other sub-individualities, that is, it enters the domain of the trans-individual. The chaos of a contemporary dance club can be regarded as a metaphor for this trans-individuality. It is possible to distinguish between pairs, figures, styles of expression, and sexes during quadrille or even rock dancing, which is late modernity. But in a modern dance club, there are creatures of uncertain sex, undefined appearance, and vague identity, regularly moving to the beat of the music. Moreover, the dancing has a hyper-individualistic nature, the dancers are not moving, they are being moved. What moves each dancer, moves the others. Are they moving separately? No, their bodies are moving simultaneously, giving into a common resonance. Something like this is happening in politics, the de-individualization of the individual and the sub- and trans-individualization of political institutions and structures. Thus, we are confronting a completely new politics, the essence of which is the denial of politics itself as a certain distinct, authoritative line. No matter how we solve the question of power, to whom it belongs, to the elite, to the caste, to the priests, to the warriors, or to the democratic parliament, it will still be a formalization of political relations. Interests, positions, levels, statuses, and roles are always visible. We are dealing with a political society, be it modern or traditional. But if one proposes to remove the very question of power, if one says there is no such concept, if we are compelled to withdraw this question, if the notion of the subject of the political process is forbidden, it will be ousted by a rhizomatic entity. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari use the term rhizome and rhizomatic to describe theory and research that allows for multiple, non-hierarchical entry and exit points in data representation and interpretation, which Hart and Negri name a multitude. These multitudes act for both subject and authority. Consequently, the concept of the state is replaced by the concept of the post-state. What is the post-state? It is the idea of the abolition of the state. The process of the demonization of the state starts, the basis of which is the thesis that the state interferes with private property. The word the state itself eventually becomes an invective, and after this, its abolition becomes an obvious measure. After that, everything that interferes with absolute freedom is abolished. In the end, all forms of vertical symmetry, the orientation of a top-to-bottom hierarchy, are subject to destruction, and everything becomes horizontal. Similarly, the vertical lines of power and the state become horizontal, and thus political anthropology, implying this or that constitution of the individual, dissipates and disperses in the space of rhizomatic dust. One could call it apolitia. But if it really were apolitia, we would observe a gradual fading of the political, its entropy. But we are not speaking about apolitia or indifference towards politics. Instead, we encounter a deliberate, axiological trend. That is the liquidation of political structures, or the structure of the political, if we include the structures of both political pre-modernity and modernity. That is, while confronting post-modernity, both of them are rejected. At the same time, in order to actively denounce the political will is required. It turns out that post-modernity is loaded with political meaning. And it is loaded with an imperious, epistemologically obsessional meaning and an obligatory political meaning of apoliticization at that. That is, this is not pure entropy of the political structure, it is a revolutionary counter-project, a theoretical scheme of political post-anthropology. And the core of this post-anthropology is, of course, this rhizomatic sub-and trans-individual network. It is this dispersed nebula of multitude that is deliberately destroying the structures of the will that belong to the political, das Politische, in its classical Schmittian meaning. The core subjects of post-politics. Today we can sum up the situation in this way: we add the destructive, corrosive strategy of political postmodernity, possessing the same authoritative, offensive dispositive, into the sphere of the political, which is Schmitt's classical politics, including pre-modernity and modernity, and we receive politics in its widest meaning, in its absolute meaning. This is the absolute political, absolute politische, in the boundaries of which we can place two basic anthropological models. It sounds natural. The first is contemporary man, constructed by the political, struggling against politics as such. He is like a dancer at a club. He has his blog, he watches TV, he pretends he votes for the opposition, that is, he latently identifies himself with the destructive, anti-state political trend, even if he lacks a well-thought-out, coherent politics. When confronting any integral political concept, he starts by saying no. His attitude toward it is very aggressive, and it creates a specifically aimed influence. The other figure is the political soldier, das politische Soldat. The political soldier is a different concept, developed in the 1930s, which is a personality, summing up what we have called the classical approach to das Politische, the classical approach to the political. Its definition is very picturesque. The political soldier differs from the common man by the fact that he kills and dies for politics. His killing and personal death become an existential element of the manifestation of the political, and thus, for him the political acquires an existential dimension. The politician, unlike the political soldier, deals with the political, but never kills or dies for it. When the politician confronts death and murder, he says, "No, I'd better rethink my convictions." This is a wonderful romantic image, employed as a part of modernity and the 20th century, where we could see these splendid political soldiers. Nietzsche's words illustrate their role in the history of the 20th century. Although wars in the 19th century were fought for material goals, a warlike age is approaching that will above all restore honor to bravery. For it shall pave the way for a still higher age, and gather the strength, that the latter will one day need the age that will carry heroism into the search for knowledge and wage wars for the sake of thoughts and their consequences. When is this time? It was the 20th century. The entirety of the 20th century was filled with political soldiers killing each other for their beliefs. They killed and were killed. Besides, every traditional society, for example that of Genghis Khan's, was founded by political soldiers. The Russian Empire was also built by political soldiers. Modernity was very sensitive to this figure. They say the political soldier fights only for elevated and spiritual ideas. But that is not the case. Even a liberal can become a political soldier, although there is nothing spiritual or noble in liberal ideas. He may die for quite senseless ideas, but he remains a political soldier, and that is very important. The political soldier is an instrumental notion, and should not be hyperbolized. It is a charming but purely utilitarian element of modernity. We believe that, on the level of political anthropology, this political soldier is confronting the decomposed, rhizomatic post-human android. We register this reading, and it may seem that we are ready to throw away our ideological differences and for the political soldier to confront the postmodern world. But my thesis is that, from the perspective of the phase shift we are in, we are living in a society where this conflict is possible, but at the same time, its outcome is predetermined. In fact, the figure of the political man is removed, and his anthropological space is being occupied by a new personality, a very cunning and suspect personality, which is not that of the political soldier, but at the same time is not related to the hissing, rhizomatic, twittering sub-individual. This personality is the political man's simulacrum. It is something that imitates the political soldier in the same way that postmodernity imitates modernity. In the final analysis, the readings do not give us the human versus post-human scenario. Instead, what we see is the undisguised, rotten liberal post-human and the pseudo-human, the pseudo-soldier, within whom the general substance of this phase of history has found itself. This is why we have the phenomenon of contemporary fascism, which is an excellent illustration of this condition. Every last vestige of fascism that was embodied by political soldiers ran out in 1945. Each and every declared fascist after 1945 is a simulacrum. The liberals' fears, taking the form of fascists, is a complete parody. They do not differ much from the decomposed and half-dissolved masses. Communism, which has held out longer than fascism, created its simulacrum within itself. The late communists were already pseudo-political soldiers. Today there are no chances for communism to return to life. The same goes for fascism. Soon, we will see that liberalism has arrived at the same point. At least our liberals, who are not really liberals at all, demonstrate this. Give them some money, and they will declare anything and everything. We are dealing with entities lacking anything resembling the classical political anthropology. The fatalism of post-anthropology and Angelpolis. As much as can be discerned, we are dealing with Deleuze's fold. The concept allows for creative thought about the production of subjectivity, and ultimately about the possibilities for and the production of non-human forms of subjectivity. We have the confrontation of post-political anthropology and the pseudo-political soldier. In this case, the antithesis of the post-human is the non-human. If we face it, we acquire a very complex and intriguing perspective. It is either phantasmagoric despair, to which Baudrillard, describing the world with radical post-historical categories, gave way, or the feeling that we are not satisfied with this fold, this post-anthropological perspective. However, if we grasp the fatality of this pair, we can calmly step back and assess the situation. Having raised the question of anthropology, we must look for a solution, and at the same time we must acknowledge this post-anthropology, that is, not wait for what is coming to arrive, but to consider, instead, that it is already here. What do we gain from this perspective? I think that Schmitt, who created the classical approach to the political, might give us some hints. He spoke about political theology. Schmitt said that all political ideologies and systems are integral theological models with religions, dogmas, institutions, and rights of their own. That is why, in order to understand politics, one must regard it as a religious phenomenon. But political theology presupposes the existence of the political telos, which can be constructed by man, like Hobbes' Leviathan, or it can be of non-human construction, such as the Catholic model of imperium, which was close to Schmitt's heart. Naturally, in the post-anthropological structure, in postmodernity, this appeal to telos as a political factor which unfolds the system into an integral theology will not help us much, as we have crossed the boundaries of political theology. It is impossible to speak about political anthropology while describing the post-anthropological model of today's politics. We are forbidden to speak about an integral political theology because we have witnessed this fundamental mutation of the fold. What are we allowed to speak about? We have political processes, sources of power and dispositives of influence. We observe paradigmatic epistemologies, which are pushed and promoted in the same way as they were in the framework of classical politics. They remain with us, which means that the political in its wider sense is here. It is simply that neither man nor God is there. Who is the actor of this post-politics? There is a certain hypothesis that I call the concept of Angelopolis, the city of angels, or Angelpolitia, angelic politics, that is a turn from political theology to political angelology. What this means is that the sphere of the political is starting to be controlled by and is starting to ground itself upon the confrontation between superhuman entities. That is, entities that are neither human nor divine, or not divine at all. Angelopolis possesses a huge potential to assign political roles without taking humanoids and post-humanoids into account. For example, one may think that a man sends an SMS, but it is actually the SMS that sends itself. Considering the growing level of standardization and lack of originality in these messages, its over-individualistic essence is becoming more and more evident. There really is a command center in post-politics. There are actors and there are decisions, but they are totally dehumanized in postmodernity. They are beyond the frames of anthropology. We can find a certain proof of this hypothesis in traditional teachings and in traditional eschatologies, which state that the end times will not be triggered by the human hand, but that it will stop just prior to the final hour. The final act will not depend on man. It will be a war of angels, a war of gods, a confrontation of entities, not tied by historical or economic laws and patterns, and which do not identify themselves with religions or certain political elites. And this angelic war can be thought of politically. That is Angelopolis, or politisch angelology, which I bring forward as a concept, devoid of mysticism and esotericism, which has the same sense and nature as Schmidt's metaphor of political theology. Political angelology must be considered as a metaphor which is both scientific and rational. Angelopolis is a method to understand, to interpret, and to hermeneutically decipher the contemporary processes which surround us and are regarded as being alienated from political anthropology, from humanity as a species, and as a politically institutionalized and constituted notion. 12. Fourth political practice. The adherents of the fourth political theory are in need of a plan. The plan is based on the following idea: if we have the fourth political theory as a set of concepts and a theoretical definition, then this theory must be realized, because every theoretical construction can either be brought to life or cannot because of circumstances. Therefore, if we theorize and talk about the fourth political theory, we should also think about how it could be realized in practice. However, this should give us pause, because the fourth political theory strains to conclude the political topography of modernity, with all its implicit and hidden dualistic models therein. We can develop a scheme representing the correlation between the theory and its practice in different fields of knowledge: science, metaphysics, religion, philosophy, technologies, and common use. Below is a table with these different fields of knowledge on the horizontal axis and with two columns on the vertical axis, term 1 and term 2. The first column concerns the field theoretically, and the second deals with the field in practice. Field. Term 1. Term 2. Science. Theory, contemplation. Practice, things. Field. Term 1. Term 2. Metaphysics. Principle. Manifestation. Field. Term 1. Term 2. Religion. Myth. Ritual. Field. Term 1. Term 2. Philosophy. Mentality. Activity. Field. Term 1. Term 2. Technology. Idea, project. Realization, implementation. Field. Term 1. Term 2. Common use. Thinking. Action. Of course, the consideration of these columns in itself can bring us to some very interesting conclusions, starting with the question of what theory is in terms of science, i.e., contemplation, vision, and what is praxis, the term, formed from the Greek pragma, i.e., object, objectification, acting. When the problem of defining what a thing is, res, hereafter reality, arose a few years ago, the attempts to come across a counterpart of this basic term in contemporary philosophy led to the revelation that there is no acceptable equivalent for this Latin word in Greek at all. There is pragma as an action and the act at the same time. It is an active object, but not as an accomplishment. And there is an existent from Aristotle, which is expounded as residential in further Latin translations. Therefore, there is no such word as thing in Greek, and this is very important because it means that the concept of reality is also absent. Reality is formed on the basis of res, reality is a property of res, reality is whose? What? Something referring to the thing, or thingness. Therefore, there are the Greek words pragma, existent, and practice for the Latin res. Pragma is the action and the object at the same time. It is very interesting. The entirety of Greek metaphysics evolves between theory as contemplation and action, praxis, keeping short of severe Latin subjectivity, the thingness hidden in the term res. If we amplify the aforementioned duality of this table, we would come across Ganon's model of the principle of the manifested, notably, that the manifestation here is closer to the practice, but not to that which is manifested. We can see the activity in the second column concerning practice. If we make some further assertions in the history and sociology of religion, we would come across functionalism and the human sociology of Malinowski, which examines this division between myth and ritual. The original Greek definition of myth must be remembered. Myth is a story being told during a ritual. The duality of myth and ritual is one of the basic items extensively discussed in both the history of religion and of social anthropology. In philosophy can be seen the mentality activity, or mental activity. This pairing and duality of terms is similar to that of theory practice. And finally, technology is rather simple. It is the duality of a project and its realization. So, we have two columns. If the fourth political theory is added to the first column, term 1, then we can probably find some specific concept in the fourth political practice to place in the column term 2 in accordance with it. If the fourth political theory was an ideological variation, or some combination of the elements of the political theories of modernity, we would follow this strictly. That is to say, if we create an additional concept, constructed of the same elements and based on the same topography as the political ideologies of modernity are, we should talk about the field not only theoretically, but also in practice, in the column term 2. And generally, it would be interesting to do this, because talking about semantic fields associated with the fourth political theory in connection with the column term 2 could be very useful. But I leave this problem for someone else and propose another way. The point is that if we talk about the very core of the fourth political theory and its fundamental problems, we understand that the main idea of the fourth political theory is to walk away from the dualism between the subject and the object, between intention and realization, and from the dual topography which the philosophy of modernity, the science of modernity, and the politology of modernity are based on. It is not mere chance that we talk about Dasein as the subject of political theory. Dasein, as proposed by Heidegger, is a way to overcome the subject-object duality, that is, an aspiration to find the root of ontology. Heidegger mentioned the Inzwischen, or the between, while talking about the existence of Dasein. The principal nature of Dasein is being between. Dasein is Inzwischen. We should not use the system of classical political dualism, the scientific topography of both modernity and Aristotle's time while talking about the fourth political theory, and presume the fact that the subject and its core, the basis of the fourth political theory pole, is Dasein. It is necessary, instead, to examine fourth political practice in another way, taking into account Heidegger's criticisms of constructing non-fundamental ontology, i.e., ontology as it is. Heidegger said that if we want to understand Dasein, we should realize and construct a fundamental ontology which would not lose contact with the ontic, that which exists, reality, roots of Dasein, and would not ascend or sublimate, sooner or later, to anything correlated with the 2000-year-old, from Plato, or even the last of the pre-Socratic philosophers, up to Nietzsche, general philosophical constructions on which modernity is based. We should put Dasein as the center and the pole of the fourth political theory. What does this mean in the context of practice? It means that Dasein should not be qualified either as a theoretical construction or as a principle. Should it be used as a myth, like a narrative? This comes much closer, but it should be carefully considered. It should not exactly be used as a mentality, at least not as an ontological mentality. Likewise, it should not be used as an idea or anything concerning the subject. Keeping this universal and pre-dualistic status of Dasein in Heidegger's philosophy in mind, I want to suggest a reference to some root, to something that predates this dualism, to define fourth political practice. In other words, what is the center of fourth political practice? This center is something that lies between the columns, between term 1 and term 2, between theory and practice. But this does not at all mean their combination or a happy medium. A happy medium is nonsense that we should distance ourselves from. We should not look for a happy medium or a compromise of column 1 and column 2, the polarity of theory and practice, but we should find the root that these pairs grow from, their common root. From the perspective of Dasein analytics, both the subject and object are ontological constructions grown from the between, i.e., the Intuition. We are interested in the instance that both theory and practice appeared from, the instance where theory and practice are not yet divided and, a fortiori, are not opposites. We are interested in that kind of instance where both principle and manifestation have a common root. They can never have a common root, not for a moment, and that is most interesting for us, that kind of instance where myth and ritual are not yet separated, at that instance where mentality and activity are in common, where idea means realization and realization is idea, and where thinking and acting have one source. We are interested in this very intermediate level not achieved by a horizontal consideration of these pairs, but only by a new, non-horizontal dimension. Unlike Hegelianism, Marxism, communication theory, and in principle, the entire structure of modernity, we are not interested in anything that sits upon the line between theory and practice. We are looking for something that does not belong to horizontal subspace, or to some ratio-based configuration of the columns, or to the line between theory and practice. We are interested in something hidden under the theory and practice, somewhere in the common root they both grow from. From this point of view, the question of the prioritization of either conscience or matter during the Soviet period is absolutely wrong. The priority for us is the problem of the common root, and we should grow the fourth political theory and its practice from this root. Having acknowledged this notion as being basic, we can say that fourth political theory is theory to the same degree as it is practice, and it is practice to the same degree as it is theory. In other words, if we can feel the between related in depth over these two columns, if we can seize the geometry of this political vector, that is, of course, its real philosophical and metaphysical vector, we will see that these two trees grow from the same root. If we focus on the subject of the fourth political theory, meaning Dasein or Intuition, we will understand that it does not belong to the horizontal disposition between these two columns. Why do we talk about roots but not the head? This is a very serious and deep moment, because we should realize the reduction that is being made. If we realize the horizontal reduction first, and we get an unsatisfactory result, we will conclude that we should instead realize the vertical reduction to move towards ontic roots, but not ontological heights. Therefore, we should postpone such notions as the dimension of spirit and the divine, and move towards chaos and other vertical and depth-oriented concepts. Nietzsche said, "Not when truth is dirty, but when it is shallow the seeker of knowledge steps reluctantly into its water." According to this, how can we try to form a clear conception of what fourth political practice is? By reversing the order of these two columns as a first step. We should obtain practice as theory, take principle as manifestation, mentality as activity, and thinking as action. What is fourth political practice? It is contemplation. What is the manifestation of the fourth political practice? It is a principle to be revealed. In what aspect is the myth realized as ritual? It becomes theurgic fact. Let us recognize that Neoplatonic theurgy is the reanimation of statues. What is activity as mentality? It is the idea that thoughts are magic, that thoughts can change reality. It is a suggestion that thoughts replace reality as fact. Fourth political practice brings us to the nature of the supernatural world, to the antithesis of Weber's metaphor in the realization of the technological aspect of the project. What is the supernatural world? It is a world where there is no barrier between idea and realization. It is the principle of adopting a magical view of the world based on the idea that thought is the only thing that crosses worlds, and everything we cross with is nothing more than a thought. What kind of thought is it? Pure thought. The vehicle of fourth political theory and practice lives in a supernatural world. What is menactivity? It is a trans-substance, a transformation of spirit into body and body into spirit, and it is the main problem of Hermeticism. We have come to the realization that fourth political practice is not a rough realization of fourth political theory in some space where the theory is suggested to be different from its practice. There is no more space, no more topos, and no more topology in fourth political practice aside from theory. We have annihilated any other spaces before we started, not in the consummation but in the very beginning, before we started in a pre-ontological context. In other words, we should not look forward, it will never be changed, or backward if we really want to change the squalor we live in, because all the remnants that have made this ultimate form of degeneration possible and real have appeared and been stored there. These roots are not mere chance. The scrap heap we exist in is not accidental and has a profound logic. Here, primordial metaphysics is expressed in techniques both modern and postmodern. Accordingly, the only path for real political struggle is appealing to the fourth political practice as to the roots, free from the evolutionary process, from the very conception to the final point where we are now, because either our political struggle is soteriological and eschatological, or it has no meaning. And here we come to the last point. What does a world avoiding any duality look like? It looks like postmodernity, like virtuality. The wired and virtual contemporary world just says, this is not theory and not practice, not principle and not manifestation, not myth and not ritual, not thought and not action. Virtuality is just a mockery of fourth political theory and practice. It is counterintuitive enough, but this postmodern reality is closer than all previous topologies, including the theological and proto-theological. Virtuality is closer to the very unique model of fourth political theory and practice than any other element. Thus we can raise the question, how does our traditionalism or new metaphysics relate to postmodernity? I consider them to be very close. Virtuality tries to mix the semantic fields of the columns on the horizontal level so as to become indistinguishable. We can say that Deleuze's rhizome is a postmodern and post-structural mockery of Heidegger's Dasein. They are alike and they are often described in the same terms. But pay attention to the fact of how postmodernism solves the problem of the reversal of the column's order. It solves the problem by appealing to the surface, and this is the main idea we see with Deleuze. Remember his interpretation of Artaud's body without organs, his interpretation of the necessity of destruction, of the leveling of structure, and his interpretation of man's epidermis, his outer layer, as the basis for the screen onto which his image is projected. It is a point of mockery where fourth political theory and postmodernism meet each other. If the columns mix horizontally, some madness appears. We can use the thesis that Homo integros, the complete integral man, consists of Homo sapiens and Homo demens. Deleuze says, free Homo demens. He says that madness should escape from under Homo sapiens and realize the transgression between these two columns in the political sphere. Here comes the rhizomatic process, ionic and chronological ideas of temporality. This postmodern dementia is much like the fourth political theory and differs from it only in its horizontality and flatness. The main problem of postmodernity is its elimination of any vertical orientation in terms of both height and depth. The end times and the eschatological meaning of politics will not realize themselves on their own. We will wait for the end in vain. The end will never come if we wait for it, and it will never come if we do not. This is essential because history, time, and reality have special strategies to avoid Judgment Day, or rather, they have a special strategy of a reversionary maneuver that will create the impression that everyone has come to a realization and an understanding. This is the huge arsenal of Heidegger's Noch nicht, or eternal not yet. If the fourth political practice is not able to realize the end of times, then it would be invalid. The end of days should come, but it will not come by itself. This is a task, it is not a certainty. It is active metaphysics. It is a practice. And it can be a potential and rational solution of the enigmatic layers that are discovered while talking about fourth political practice. 13. Gender in the fourth political theory. To begin with, let us analyze what tenets about gender are characteristic of the political theories of modernity. If we attentively examine the perspective from which socialism, liberalism, nationalism, fascism, and National Socialism all operate, we will notice that some features are common to the classical understanding of gender in all the political theories of modernity. On the one hand, it is not original to modernity, because modernity here follows traditional European society, even pre-modern Christianity, which was mostly patriarchal. Even before Christianity, it was patriarchal, back until those immemorial times in the Mediterranean which were discussed by Bachofen in his book, Mother Right. In other words, behind modernity, and behind modernity's conception of gender, is Western or global patriarchy. This patriarchy has heavily influenced the structure and political understanding of gender in modernity. However, this patriarchy has undergone certain modifications in the final formulation of gender norms in the political theories of modernity. It is acceptable to consider a gender in sociological terms, in other words, gender as a socially constructed phenomenon. This is in contrast to the anatomical sex inherent in biological terms. Gender is a social convention which can change from society to society. At the same time, the political formulation of gender is the social norm, which is approved as an imperative on the basis of political power. Thus, archaic societies practice rites of passage or initiations after which a boy can be regarded as a man, otherwise he has no social sex, no gender, and is deprived of a man's social functions, marriage, participation in hunting, and ritual. Depending on a society's requirements, gender tenets can change. For example, in some slave-holding societies, male slaves were not thought of as men, and were made to wear women's clothing. Slaves were used as women because they did not have the social status of men. Hence the phenomenon of castration, the deprivation of the physical attributes of men on a par with their social status. Therefore, gender is both a social phenomenon and a political one. Political, because we are dealing with the management of social norms regulated by a society, community, police, and so on, the retreat from which leads to a variety of sanctions. The three political theories of modernity all ask the same questions: who is the political person? And what is the political gender? At first, the person is the man. From the sociological point of view, women became persons only recently, and this raises the question of women's political rights. From the viewpoint of modernity, a woman is not a person. A person can only be a man, however, not every man, only a special type of man. The characteristics of a real man include wealth. Until the end of the 19th century in Europe, property was a necessary attribute of citizenship, i.e., political gender, rationality, thrift, and living in a city. The peasant was not considered an equal in socio-political significance. Thus, in the elections of the First State Duma in Russia in 1905, the voice of one townsman was equal to 100 peasants' voices. In modernity, a peasant is not quite a person. Other characteristics of being a man include maturity and age. These socio-professional and age categories are included in the concepts of gender and gender functions. The last characteristic is that a man must belong to European civilization and have white skin. When considerations of cultural superiority and racism are taken together, this is the political man, or el homme politique, from an anthropological point of view. Such gender tenets are an axis for all three major political ideologies of modernity and their derivations. However, within these ideologies there are differences in relation to this figure of the man. The most male-affirming is the theory of liberalism, as it considers this figure of the rational, rich, adult white male as the norm and as a natural phenomenon. Liberalism canonizes this conception of gender and standardizes it, trying to eternalize this bourgeois social system typical of 18th and 19th century Europe. Liberalism asserts the factuality of this gender and projects it onto the future. The modern world is constructed by men, conceived and anticipated by men, and will belong to men, Homo economicus and Homo faber. Such an understanding of gender is undergoing changes with time. The area of gender, that is men, increases. The standard archetype begins to include the peasants, the poor, women, and then the non-white races. How does this mechanism apply to the case of women? For women, manly characteristics start to be attributed to them. A businesswoman is one who manifests male qualities. White females become citizens. Thus, the woman starts to be thought of as the man. So, liberal feminism, or the aspiration to give women freedom, means to identify a woman as a man and thus equalize them socio-politically, that is, represent a woman as a man socially. The same procedure is applied to represent the rural peasant as an urban city dweller, the non-white races as white, the poor as rich, the stupid as reasoning. A woman who sits behind the wheel of a car is a man or a caricature of a man. However, under liberalism, the divisions of the social conceptions of gender remain. Woman may acquire the same technical rights as men, and thus, in performing the functions of a man, may be considered as equal to men, but the social construction of the man and the woman is unchanged. The second political theory, Marxism, starts from the same position, that gender is a bourgeois political construction. But this situation is criticized, and the need to change this situation is expressed. From here develops an idea of total equality, including in terms of gender. The concept of gender equality in the second political theory qualitatively differs from the understanding of equality in the first political theory. The feminism or gender egalitarianism of Marxism contends that both men and women who exist in the context of Marxist ideology cease to be men and women who constitute the standard and imperative gender division of liberalism. That is, we see a desire to move beyond gender in the bourgeois interpretation. In fact, the man here loses the sole possession of rationality. The Hungarian neo-Marxist philosopher George Lukács said that the dialectical method, as the true historical method, was reserved for the class which was able to discover within itself on the basis of its life experience the identical subject-object, the subject of action, the we of the Genesis, namely the proletariat. Proceeding from such a formulation, classical Marxists consistently call for insanity, to schizophrenia, to the schizo-revolutionary delos. They rely on the urban poor and the proletarians, who could never become full-fledged bourgeois. They turn to the non-white urban populations. However, they ignore those who live in rural areas or peasants, seeing them through the prism of bourgeois perception. But on the whole, in the gender policy of the communists, we see a new tendency. They recognize the status quo of gender and offer to change it under the banner of historical materialism. This means the transgression of bourgeois man in the downward direction, and the appeal to the material substance, literally what stands below the substate, to the undifferentiated realm of work, where there is no qualitative difference between the good cooking woman, the sailor, or the masculine hero. Marxists venture even lower down, where nothing is left of gender hierarchies and strategies. Thus, the most extreme Marxist ideas have a desire to destroy the bourgeois archetype. The reality of practice, however, was different from the theory. In Stalin's Russia, the male archetype, the rational, domineering man prevailed, despite attempts to recreate Marxist gender equality immediately commensurate with the revolution of 1917. But the idea of overcoming the social construction of the man through the reference to anatomy, to the desiring machine, is characteristic of Marxism. Fascism, the third political theory, accepts the model of the urban, white, European, rational, wealthy man and exalts in it. If liberalism accepts this model as the norm, then fascism begins to gift the man with additional properties. In National Socialism, he should be not simply be white, but Nordic white, not just rational, but in possession of the unique form of reason that only the Germanic Aryan race possesses. This is similar to the position of Levi-Bruhl, who postulated that only the Europeans have a logos, and that other peoples are guided by pre-logical, non-civilized social structures. Masculinity was further exalted, and women were urged to be engaged only in Kinder, Kirchen, und Kuchen, children, church, and kitchen. Other tenets of gender were offered peripherally, for example, by Julius Evola in his The Metaphysics of Sex, in which the superiority of the masculine over the feminine is asserted. It is argued that men are dormant potential gods, and women are dormant potential goddesses, but standing a little lower in the hierarchy of the sexes. While considering the third political theory, the fringe conception of Nordic matriarchy should also be mentioned. There was an ontology of the feminine. Hermann Wirth, a disciple of Bachofen, argued that the supreme being is a woman, but that women are completely different from men, a woman in her ontology, Weissfrau. However, in the third political theory, the image created by liberalism, and then exaggerated, remained the norm. The fourth political theory represents an aspiration to overcome the gender construction of the three political theories of modernity. In this case, what is its gender strategy, its imperative? First of all, the fourth political theory puts outside the brackets the man, in other words, that man as a gender with social constructions that are characteristic of modernity. The fourth political theory does not address such a last man, as he represents the closed archetype of modernity. Outside of the sphere of gender, the fourth political theory gropes with the contours of its man. In the face of this construction of man as he who possesses reason, wealth, responsibility, city, white skin color, and so on, we revolt. This image of man must die. He doesn't have a chance to survive, as he is closed inside modernity's historical deadlock. He reproduces the small hierarchies and cannot go beyond his own borders. Such a man believes himself to be immortal. In self-reflection he creates permanent realities, mirrors looking in mirrors. The same goes for all those images to which the man of modernity has been extended, the businesswoman, non-whites in respectable roles, and so on. The positive attribute of man, beyond the paradigm of modernity, is the non-adult. The subject of the fourth political theory is a non-adult male. For example, Le Grand Jeu of Gilbert Lecomte and René Daumal, who offered to live their lives without maturing to remain playing at being children. This can be considered as an invitation to develop gender tenets for the fourth political theory, a system of aesthetic and political philosophy. Under the concept of the non-white man lies the pre-logical world system of Levi-Bruhl, where the logos is not the only means of social organization. Here we draw from Levi-Strauss a theory of social anthropology and ethnosociology drawn from the analysis of the experience of many non-white societies. Further, from madness, all forms of intellectual transgression, the practice of voluntary insanity from Friedrich Hölderlin and Nietzsche to Butterley and Artaud. Madness is part of the gender arsenal of the fourth political theory. In general, non-white/European, insane, non-urban or defined by a constructed landscape. For example, the ecologist or aboriginal, that is, the person who did not break with nature, as discussed by Redfield in his The Folk Society. Thus, we create a search algorithm woven of all those elements that are ignored or rejected by modernity. These elements make up a huge field of existence and metaphysics, a field of the intensive being of the fourth political theory. Supplementing the fourth political theory, we should refuse all those tenets about gender which liberalism carries within itself. From the second political theory's gender conception, it would be permissible to borrow the idea of the desiring machine, the idea of overcoming the man through global egalitarianism within the limits of the material. From the classical fascist gender model of the third political theory, as well as liberalism, there is nothing to learn, while the conceptions developed on their fringes may be of great interest, namely sex ontologization from Evola and the idea of Nordic matriarchy. What is the subject of the fourth political theory? The subject of the fourth political theory is Dasein or Zwischen, the between in the space between the subject and the object, which it is possible to identify with the anthropological trajectory of Gilbert Durand. Within Dasein trajectory, l'imaginaire, is there a social conception of sex? And what is the gender of Dasein? It is necessary to formulate the normative and imperative gender of the fourth political theory. Gender in the fourth political theory is the same as sex in Dasein, that is, we have explained one unknown through another. Dasein can somehow be sexualized, but that sex which it has cannot be either male or female. It may make sense to speak about it in terms of the androgyne. Should we say that the fourth political theory may be addressed to the androgynous being, and its gender is the androgyne? Perhaps, but only if it is possible not to project onto the androgynous the obviously split models of sex as halves of a whole. Sex, according to Plato, is a unity that has been divided. So trajectory is that which, according to Durand, is between the subject and the object, and is defined in relation to them, as in Dasein which, according to Heidegger, is in Zwischen, on the border between the internal and external, constituting itself on the existential border between the division of unity. And the concept of l'imaginaire contains division within itself, in Greek, delta iota alpha rho epsilon sigma iota, as one of its possible regimes. So if we understand the androgyne in this way, not as something that is composite, but as something rooted or radical, then we can talk about a radical notion, which is not sex in the sense that it is half of something else. That is, the gender of the fourth political theory is that half, that sex which is simultaneously the whole, and does not need its antithesis, and is therefore self-sufficient within itself. We can theorize about this gender that it does not so much come about from an analysis of sexual or gender archetypes, but because of thinking philosophically and politically upon the subject of the fourth political theory. Thus, we change the formulation of the question. We do not ask which sex is Dasein, we answer that the gender of the subject of the fourth political theory is the same as that of Dasein. In this case, we can also talk about the radical, root, from the Latin ridicula, androgyne, which exists not as a result of a combination of the man and the woman, but that represents instead the primordial, untouched unity. How does gender change under the conditions of postmodernity? The postmodern represents a combination of all three political theories. On the one hand, this is an accomplished modernity which has reached its logical end as hypermodern or ultramodern. Thus, all three political theories project onto postmodernity their own gender archetypes, which represented the limits of their own structures. These limits are expressed through an institutionalization of gender in postmodernity. What is the postmodern gender? It is a maximization of the liberal man, the archetype of which applies to all of its antitheses, the stupid, the poor, the non-white, the little, and so forth. It is also the gender of globalization, when the properties of a certain type are extended as social standards onto all other types as universalism. Hence the idea that the proletarians are only the bourgeoisie, who have not grown rich yet, blacks are unmodernized whites, and women are not yet fully liberated men. That is, we see that this all-consuming archetype becomes meaningless. The re-extension of existing gender models can lead to the explosion of the hypermodern like a rotting fungus, and its gender archetypes will fail. Now we are in this moment of a postmodern re-extension, and the final breaking of gender. The stages of this break are feminism, homosexuality, sex change operations, and transhumanity. In the West, the second political theory had a great influence on the elites, particularly the creative professions, actors, writers, philosophers, etc. This is the desiring machine, incorporating leftist feminism with its ideas of freedom from sex. Donna Haraway is such a feminist, or rather loosely a neo-Marxist and a postmodernist. She argued that while the mature woman may feel an urge to be liberated, liberation in our culture involves definition of the opposite. Therefore, it is necessary to overcome both the man and the woman through becoming a cyborg. According to her, sex can be overcome only by having overcome being human. In a similar vein is Foucault's conception of sexuality, that is, sexuality prior to sex, as a neutral dispositive, sexuality, spreading along the surface of the screen, the body without organs. This pansexuality, which is a smooth surface of sexual arousals, remains unclear in terms of from whom it is derived, for what reason, and most importantly, no matter in what orientation or direction. As a whole, in terms of the erosion and destruction of the gender constructions of modernity, Marxist thought introduces the most significant contribution. Elements of fascism in postmodernity are represented by the practice of BDSM. Contemporary fascism contains strong elements of sadomasochism, and perverted fascism is an essential attribute of postmodernism, along with feminism, cyborgs, a body without organs, and so on. Eventually, we find ourselves in an interesting situation. The predominant gender of modernity is exposed as a re-extension of its original conception, is fast eroding and, in some instances, is about to explode, or perhaps has already exploded. We stand on a transition between the hypermodern and the postmodern, and we do not know where the truth and where the reality lies. So, in a postmodern construction of gender, there will not be any men. Let us imagine this situation. The archetype of the man falls into pieces, which do not constitute parts of the whole anymore, but symbolize only themselves. Conservative forces can stand up for this archetype, demand the return of masculinity, this reasonable, wealthy white person, but thereby, they only try to continue modernity through gender reconstructions. This position seems hopeless, and here again the fourth political theory, in our opinion, goes forward. We suggest taking a step towards gender as Dacian, despite the notorious representations and opprobrium that we will cause. By going beyond the limits of gender which we know, we get to the domain of uncertainty, androgyny, and sex as practiced by the angels. In the same sphere, it is necessary to search for a gender of the fourth political theory, namely by taking risks in looking behind the limits of the collapsed chimera of modernity. We can as yet provide only outlines. We know that it is the gender of Dacian and trajectory, that this gender represents a root reality, that it belongs to l'imaginaire. By extending our investigation, we can raise the question about the gender of the radical self, which is beyond the basic paradigms. 14. Against the postmodern world. The evil of unipolarity. The current world is unipolar, with the global West as its center and with the United States as its core. This kind of unipolarity has geopolitical and ideological characteristics. Geopolitically, it is the strategic dominance of the Earth by the North American hyperpower and the effort of Washington to organize the balance of forces on the planet in such a manner as to be able to rule the whole world in accordance with its own national imperialistic interests. It is bad because it deprives other states and nations of their real sovereignty. When there is only one power which decides who is right and who is wrong, and who should be punished and who not, we have a form of global dictatorship. This is not acceptable. Therefore, we should fight against it. If someone deprives us of our freedom, we have to react. And we will react. The American empire should be destroyed. And at one point, it will be. Ideologically, unipolarity is based on modernist and postmodernist values that are openly anti-traditional ones. I share the vision of René Guénon and Julius Evola, who considered modernity and its ideological basis, individualism, liberal democracy, capitalism, consumerism, and so on, to be the cause of the future catastrophe of humanity, and the global domination of the Western lifestyle as the reason for the final degradation of the Earth. The West is approaching its terminus, and we should not let it drag all the rest of us down into the abyss with it. Spiritually, globalization is the creation of a grand parody, the kingdom of the Antichrist. And the United States is the center of its expansion. American values pretend to be universal ones. In reality, it is a new form of ideological aggression against the multiplicity of cultures and traditions still existing in the rest of the world. I am resolutely against Western values which are essentially modernist and postmodernist, and which are promulgated by the United States by force of arms or by obtrusion, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and perhaps soon, Syria and Iran. Therefore, all traditionalists should be against the West and globalization, as well as against the imperialist politics of the United States. It is the only logical and consequent position. So traditionalists and partisans of traditional principles and values should oppose the West and defend the rest, if the rest show signs of the conservation of tradition, whether in part or in its entirety. There can be and there really exist people, in the West and even in the United States of America itself, who do not agree with the present state of affairs, and do not approve of modernity and postmodernity. They are the defenders of the spiritual traditions of the pre-modern West. They should be with us in our common struggle. They should take part in our revolt against the modern and postmodern worlds. We would fight together against the common enemy. Another question is the structure of a possible anti-globalist and anti-imperialist front and its participants. I think that we should include in it all forces that struggle against the West, the United States, against liberal democracy, and against modernity and postmodernity. The common enemy is the necessary instance for all kinds of political alliances. This means Muslims and Christians, Russians and Chinese, both leftists and rightists, the Hindus and the Jews who challenge the present state of affairs, globalization and American imperialism. They are thus all virtually friends and allies. Let our ideals be different, but we have in common one very strong feature: hatred of the present social reality. Our ideals that differ are potential ones in potentia. But the challenge we are dealing with is actual in actu. That is the basis for a new alliance. All who share a negative analysis of globalization, westernization, and postmodernization should coordinate their effort in the creation of a new strategy of resistance to the omnipresent evil. And we can find common allies even within the United States as well, among those who choose the path of tradition over the present decadence. Towards the fourth political theory. At this point, we should raise a very important question: what kind of ideology should we use in our opposition to globalization and its liberal democratic, capitalist, and modernist, postmodernist principles? I believe that all previous anti-liberal ideologies, communism, socialism, and fascism, are no longer relevant. They tried to fight liberal capitalism and they failed. This is partly because, at the end of time, it is evil that prevails, and partly because of their inner contradictions and limitations. So it is time to begin a deep revision of the illiberal ideologies of the past. What are their positive sides? Their positive side is the very fact that they were anti-capitalist and anti-liberal, as well as anti-cosmopolitan and anti-individualist. These features should be accepted and integrated into a future ideology. But communist doctrine itself is modern, atheist, materialist, and cosmopolitan. That should be thrown out. On the other hand, communism's social solidarity, social justice, socialism, and general holistic attitude to society are good in and of themselves. So we need to separate out the materialist and modernist aspects of communism and reject them, while preserving and embracing its social and holistic aspects. As for the theories of the third way, which were dear, up to a certain point, to some traditionalists such as Julius Evola, there were many unacceptable elements, foremost among these being racism, xenophobia, and chauvinism. These are not only moral failures, but also theoretically and anthropologically inconsistent attitudes. differences between ethnicities do not equate to superiority or inferiority. The differences should be accepted and affirmed without any racist sentiments or consideration. There is no common or universal measure to judge different ethnic groups. When one society tries to judge another, it applies its own criteria, and so commits intellectual violence. This ethnocentric attitude is precisely the crime of globalization and westernization, as well as of American imperialism. If we free socialism from its materialist, atheistic and modernist features, and if we reject the racist and narrow nationalist aspects of the third way doctrines, we arrive at a completely new kind of political ideology. We call it the fourth political theory, or 4-point, the first being liberalism, that we essentially challenge, the second being the classical form of communism, and the third being National Socialism and fascism. Its elaboration starts from the point of intersection between different anti-liberal political theories of the past, namely communism and the third way theories. So we arrive at National Bolshevism, which represents socialism without materialism, atheism, progressivism, and modernism, as well as the modified third way theories. But that is only the first step. The mechanical addition of deeply revised versions of the anti-liberal ideologies of the past will not give us a final result. It is only a first approximation and preliminary approach. We must go further and make an appeal to tradition and to pre-modern sources of inspiration. There we have the Platonic ideal state, medieval hierarchical society, and theological visions of the normative social and political system, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Jewish or Hindu. These pre-modern sources are a very important development for the National Bolshevism synthesis. Therefore, we need to find a new name for this kind of ideology, and fourth political theory is quite appropriate. It does not tell us what this theory is, but rather what it is not. So it is a kind of invitation and appeal, rather than dogma. Politically, we have here an interesting basis for the conscious cooperation of the radical left-wingers and the New Right, as well as with religious and other anti-modern movements, such as the ecologists and green theorists, for example. The only thing that we insist on in creating such a pact of cooperation is to put aside anti-communist, as well as anti-fascist, prejudices. These prejudices are the instruments in the hands of liberals and globalists with which they keep their enemies divided. So we should strongly reject anti-communism as well as anti-fascism. Both of them are counter-revolutionary tools in the hands of the global liberal elite. At the same time, we should strongly oppose any kind of confrontation between the various religious beliefs: Muslims against Christians, the Jews against Muslims, the Muslims against the Hindus, and so on. The interconfessional wars and tensions work for the cause of the kingdom of the Antichrist, who tries to divide all the traditional religions in order to impose its own pseudo-religion, the eschatological parody. So we need to unite the right, the left, and the world's traditional religions in a common struggle against the common enemy. Social justice, national sovereignty, and traditional values are the three main principles of the fourth political theory. It is not easy to put together such a varied alliance. But we must try if we want to overcome the foe. In France, there is a saying coined by Alain Soral: la droite de valeurs et la gauche du travail. In Italian it goes, la destra sociale e la sinistra identitaria. How exactly it should sound in English we will see later. We could go further and try to define the subject, the actor of the fourth political theory. In the case of communism, the central subject was class. In the case of the third way movements, the central subject was either the race or the nation. In the case of religions, it is the community of the faithful. How could the fourth political theory deal with this diversity and the divergence of subjects? We propose as a suggestion that the main subject of the fourth political theory can be found in the Heideggerian concept of Dasein. It is a concrete, but extremely profound instance that could be the common denominator for the further ontological development of the fourth political theory. What is crucial for consideration is the authenticity or non-authenticity of the existence of Dasein. The fourth political theory insists on the authenticity of existence. So it is the antithesis to any kind of alienation, social, economic, national, religious, or metaphysical. But Dasein is a concrete instance. Every individual and every culture possesses their own Dasein. They differ between each other, but they are always present. Accepting Dasein as the subject of the fourth political theory, we should progress toward the elaboration of a common strategy in the process of the creation of a future that fits to our demands and our visions. Such values as social justice, national sovereignty, and traditional spirituality can serve us as the foundation. I sincerely believe that the fourth political theory, and its secondary variations, National Bolshevism and Eurasianism, can be of great use for our peoples, our countries, and our civilizations. The key manager of differences is multipolarity in all senses: geopolitical, cultural, axiological, economic, and so on. The important concept of nous, intellect, developed by the Greek philosopher Plotinus, corresponds to our ideal. The intellect is one and multiple at the same time, because it has multiple differences in itself. It is not uniform or an amalgam, but taken as such with many parts, and with all their distinct particularities. The future world should be noetic, in some way characterized by multiplicity. Diversity should be taken as its richness and its treasure, and not as a reason for inevitable conflict. Many civilizations, many poles, many centers, many sets of values on one planet and in one humanity. Many worlds. But there are some who think otherwise. Who are aligned against such a project? Those who want to impose uniformity, the one American way of life, one world. And their methods are force, temptation, and persuasion. They are against multipolarity. So they are against us. Appendix I. Political post-anthropology. 1. Each type of political system and each stage of political history operates in accordance with the normative, political type of the human. We say a man of the Middle Ages, a man of modernity, and so on, describing the specific historical and political constructs. These constructs are directly dependent on the organization and formalization of power relations in a society and relate to the axis of power, which is the essence of the political, and with the designation of one's friend and enemy, see Schmidt, which is also the essence of the political. The political is power and political identification, the self/the other. Each political form provides a different model of power and such identification. However, many political systems exist, and each has its own political anthropology. Political theology, see Schmidt, suggests that the policy and political system reflects, and in certain cases constitutes, a standard of political anthropology. 2. The political human is transformed from one form of the political to another. This is sufficiently traced in the philosophy of politics and post-philosophy. Now we will focus on which form of political anthropology meets postmodernity. 3. Postmodernity is something that sets in and steps on us. But it has not stepped yet. Therefore, the study of postmodernity suffers from an absurd creative gap. Although it can step on us, it may also not step on us, and we can, or cannot, it is not yet clear, wriggle out from under it. So, talking about postmodernity is interesting, exciting, and at the same time risky. It is a process with an unknown end and uncertain meaning. It is still possible to influence this end and this meaning. History, apparently, has ended, and post-history is only beginning, and one has to search in it for a space of struggle, to win back this space and expand it. For political post-anthropology is about forecasting and constructing the political human in postmodernity. It is normative. We do not just study what exists, we follow the process and try to affect it. Wishful thinking and self-fulfilling prophecy is quite legitimate and welcome here. By exploring political post-anthropology, we bring the political back to life. 2. Political post-humanity and the post-state. 1. The absolute features of the post-humanity of postmodernity are depoliticization, autonomization, Microscopization. Sub- and transhumanization as a special form of dehumanization. Individualization, fragmentation. That is, the rejection and denial of something that was political in the previous phases of history becomes the dominant form of politics. Politicization meets with depoliticization. The politics of the post-human of postmodernity lies in the attempt to escape from it, and in the projection of the political into the new sphere. The post-human of postmodernity declares war on the political, first, based on the economy, Homo economicus versus Homo politicus, then against the classical subject-object economy in the name of the network dynamics of the free, creative game of disengaged sets, negri and heart. The industry of fashion, celebrity, glamour and show business inculcates the idea that, to attain material prosperity, one does not need to earn money through work, one must instead enter and be recognized by the relevant social set and become a member of the ever-changing glamour network. Glossy pages on which a body without organs is sliding right and left are like a concrete embodiment of Deleuze's l'espace an image of post-economics. Actual work is not necessary, it is optional. 2. The post-political post-human overthrows power and the collective, and then his or her own individualized identity. He does not recognize the power relations over or under him, does not know self and other, and does not accept or understand anything that lies beyond the scope of his microcosm. His policy is expressed in the form of desires and vegetative impulses of unknown ownership and aims. Maybe it is desire, but this desire is no one's and is not specifically addressed anywhere. 3. It is from a random game of sub-individuality and trans-individuality that the post-human creates a model of the post-state. The post-state is an ironic parody of the state. It is the state vice versa, the state as phantom, the state as mockery. In the post-state, institutions are mobile and ephemeral. Policies and legal principles are continuously and rapidly changing. It has neither vertical nor horizontal symmetry, aiming instead to merge with the network. It is sort of a pirate republic placed in cyberspace, or a Brazilian carnival, which replaces the routine with a routine of spectacle. In the post-state, the serious and frivolous swap, and it is a kind of Saturnalia rendered permanent. In post-politics, post-humanity constitutes this post-state through being amused by its own deadly, hallucinatory game. For in political post-anthropology, all is reversed, leisure and work, the most serious occupation, actual work, is watching television shows, knowledge and ignorance. Complete idiots are given jobs as academics, public and private. The tiniest, most inane details of one's life are the center of attention in this reality show, even in political debate. Traditional male and female roles are reversed. Rather than being esteemed and experienced elders, politicians are chosen for their youth, glamour, appearance, and inexperience. Victims become the criminals and vice versa. 5. Why are we talking about post-politics when it is obviously about something directly opposite to the political? Because such an anthropological type of postmodernity, in theory and social practice, steps on, i.e., it attacks, persistently imposes itself, introduces itself, and gradually becomes the norm. It acts as a basic personality, a Gardner. And for such an attack and such an advance, dispositive of power and collective identification, the political, again, is required. But in this case, models of counterpower tend to affirm their own power, and those models that deny all forms of a type as such insist on universalization of their type. Type, in this case, is a synonym for eidos or universality. Apolitical singulars and divides compose a sort of a ruling party of postmodernity. The influential and those close to them seize power or are already in power. 6. This party has a stylistic and strategic arsenal. This is fashion and interactive information technologies, Twitter, mobile phones, social networks, blogs. In French, fashionable is often referred to by a slang word, branch, literally connected. Fashion and technology are changing rapidly, and the one who is connected is the one who is changing along with it. here and now, rapidly and dynamically. There is no yesterday and tomorrow, not even today. There is only now. Now it is Google and Twitter, but in a moment they will be prehistoric events, such as typewriters or Atari. Herein is a dramatic aspect, Paul Virilio. 7. Twitter revolutions in the Arab world or iPad presidents, such as Dmitry Medvedev, are clear signs of political post-anthropology and the phenomenon of the post-state. The revolt of the elites and the oscillation of the intensity level of consciousness of the ruling groups are near zero. A classic example is a drug addict as political strategist. 3. The political soldier and his simulacrum. 1. Like any political model, the political post-anthropology can be accepted and may be rejected. It does not matter how much it would insist on its own naturalness. A person can choose both the structure of power and his identity. The post-state, Twitter revolutions, and iPad presidents are all part of a single trend, stepping on and intruding. They may be mainstream but are not unique. There may also be alternatives. 2. The first alternative is the political anthropology of previous forms. In the face of political post-anthropology, it can be generalized by the figure of a political soldier. This is an anthropological concept. It gives no idea of what political ideology the political soldier follows. But this concept implicitly contains a belief in the existence of political ontology. The political soldier fights for a model of power relationships, and directly and openly identifies himself with a particular group, ours. A fundamental distinction of the political soldier is that he is ready and able to die for his political idea. This differentiates him from an ordinary soldier and an ordinary politician. A soldier dies, but not for a political idea. A politician fights for a political idea, but is not ready to die for it. 3. The political soldier may be a communist, a nationalist, or even a liberal. But in any case, he personalizes modernity in its specific political forms. The political soldier is a mediastinum of the political anthropology of modernity. And as such, in theory, it can fight political post-anthropology. This will be a conservative answer. An individual fights an individual. A present ending rejects the atemporal, post-historical future. The drama of the last humans clashing with post-humans in a political conflict is at once very heroic, tragic, poetic, and hopeless. 4. But political post-anthropology makes such a position almost impossible. The political soldier in the unique conditions of the corrosive waters of postmodernity is immediately converted into a simulacrum. This is the main delicacy of postmodernity. It carries an ironic mutation in regard to all aspects of modernity, in regard to anthropology in the first place. Today it is already no longer possible to meet with the political soldier, we can only meet with his double, his simulacrum, his fake. 5. In an anthropological series of political and anthropological forms, postmodernity installs a vicious link. All the threads that connect the political arena of postmodernity with modernity and deeper into political history are broken at the moment of postmodernity, and there is found a knot. After that knot, with all the visible continuity, a fake segment is situated. 6. Today there are no political soldiers. All that remains is their shells. 4. Alternative in political post-anthropology, pre-human and PC. 1. My thesis is reduced to the following affirmation: in the context of political post-anthropology, postmodernity and the post-human individual cannot be opposed to modernity and human individual. Opposing dualities will not be like the individual versus individual and post-human versus human, but like individual versus pseudo-individual and post-human versus pseudo-human. The anthropological fold, deleuze, of postmodern anthropology is this: a simulacrum meets with a simulacrum. 2. In postmodernity, a political soldier is impossible. It can only be a simulacrum. 3. Consequently, the opposition must be different. It is not a previous anthropological link that is designed to collide with a post-anthropological segment of an anthropological series, which is located after the substituted element, not, but an entirely different figure. That is, one should speak of the political expression of the radical subject. For this topic should be integrated into the fourth political theory. It is beyond the scope of this book to develop it. But in general, we can say, an alternative to political post-anthropology is also post-anthropology, but different. 5. The roots of the transgression of humanity's boundaries or limitations may not be as such as in the case of the individual. It is not really the human that meets with the post-human in the political post-anthropology, but a pre-human, the pre-concept of the human. The point of origin that came before the human is parallel to him and will remain after him. 6. Here we can also touch on the delicate theme of angelomorphosis. It is no accident that in the eschatology of most religions and traditions we are dealing with the Enkamp panoramic view, which necessarily involves angels. In Hollywood blockbusters, indeed, this also suffers from simulation. But it is inevitable. The political expression of the radical subject can be defined, not as the area of political theology, Carl Schmitt, but as the area of political angelology. This topic requires further development. Appendix 2. The metaphysics of chaos. Modern European philosophy began with the concept of logos and the logical order of being. For over 2,000 years, this concept became fully exhausted. All the potentialities and the principles laid in this logocentric way of thinking have by now been thoroughly explored, exposed, and abandoned by philosophers. However, the problem of chaos and the nature of chaos was neglected and put aside from the very beginning of this philosophy. The only philosophy we know at present is the philosophy of logos. But chaos is something opposite to logos, its absolute alternative. From the 19th century and continuing until the present day, the most important and brilliant European philosophers, such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger, began to suspect that logos was fast approaching its end. Some of them dared to suggest that, from now on, we are living in the time of the end of logocentric philosophy, and approaching something else. European philosophy was based on the logocentric principle corresponding to the principle of exclusion, the differentiating, Greek diaresis. All this corresponds strictly to the masculine attitude and reflects a patriarchal, authoritative, vertical, and hierarchical order of being and knowledge. This masculine approach to reality imposes order and the principle of exclusivity everywhere. That is perfectly manifested in Aristotle's logic, where the principles of identity and exclusion are put in the central position in the normative manner of thinking. A is equal to A, not equal to not A. This identity excludes non-identity, alterity, and vice versa. Here it is the male who speaks, thinks, acts, fights, divides, orders, and so on. Nowadays all this logocentric philosophy has come to an end, and we must consider another road for thought, not in the logocentric, phallocentric, hierarchical and exclusivist way. If logos no longer satisfies us, fascinates us, or mobilizes us, then we are inclined to try something else, and at last to address the problem of chaos. To begin with, there are two different concepts of chaos. Modern physics and philosophy refers to complex systems, bifurcation or non-integrating equations and processes, using the concept chaos to designate such phenomena. They understand by that not the absence of order, but a more complicated form of order that is difficult to perceive as such, and is, in fact, its essence. Such chaos or turbulence is calculable in nature, but with more sophisticated theoretical and mathematical means and procedures than the instruments that classical natural science is dealing with. The term chaos is used here in a metaphorical manner. In modern science, we are continuing to deal with an essentially logocentric manner of exploring reality. So the chaos here is no more than a dissipative structure of logos, the last result of its decay, fall, and decomposition. Modern science is dealing, not with something other than logos, but with a kind of post-logos, or ex-logos, logos in the state of ultimate dissolution and regression. The process of the final destruction and dissipation of logos is taken here for chaos. In reality, though, it has nothing to do with chaos as such, with chaos in the original Greek sense of the term. It is rather a kind of utmost confusion. René Guénon has called the era we are living through now an era of confusion. Confusion means the state of being that both runs parallel to order and precedes it. Thus, we should make a clear distinction between two different concepts. On one hand, we have the modern concept of chaos that represents post-order, or a mixture of contradictory fragments of being without any unity and order, linked amongst themselves by highly sophisticated post-logical correspondences and conflicts. Gilles Deleuze has called this phenomena a non-co-possible system composed by the multitude of the monads, using the concept of monads and co-possibility introduced by Leibniz, becoming for Deleuze the nomads. Deleuze describes postmodernity as a sum of non-co-possible fragments which can coexist. It was not possible in Leibniz's vision of reality, based on the principle of co-possibility. But within postmodernity we can see excluding elements coexisting. The non-ordered non-co-possible monads, or nomads, swarming around could seem to be chaotic, and in this sense we usually use the word chaos in everyday speech. But strictly speaking, we should make a distinction. We need to distinguish between two kinds of chaos: the postmodernist chaos as an equivalent to confusion, a kind of post-order, and the Greek chaos as pre-order, as something that exists before ordered reality has come into being. Only the latter can be considered as chaos in the proper sense of the word. This second, but actually the original, conception of chaos should be examined carefully and metaphysically. The epic vision of the rise and fall of logos in the course of the development of Western philosophy and Western history was first espoused by Martin Heidegger, who argued that in the context of European or Western culture, logos is not only a primary philosophical principle, but also the basis of the religious attitude forming the core of Christianity. We can also notice that the concept of kalam, or intellect, is at the center of Islamic philosophy and theology. The same is true for Judaism, at least in the vision of Philo of Alexandria, and above all in medieval Judaism and the Kabbalah. Thus in high modernity, where we are living, we assist the fall of logos accompanied by the corresponding decline of classical Greco-Roman culture and monotheistic religion as well. These processes of decadence are completely parallel to what Martin Heidegger considers the present condition of Western culture as a whole. He identifies the origin of this condition of decline in some of the hidden and hardly recognizable errors committed during the early stages of Greek thought. Something went wrong at the very beginning of Western history, and Martin Heidegger sees this wrong turn precisely in the affirmation of the exclusivist position of an exclusivist logos. This shift was made by Heraclitus and Parmenides, but above all by Plato, with the development of philosophic thought that envisaged two worlds or layers of reality where existence was perceived as the manifestation of the hidden. Later, this hidden element was recognized as logos, as the idea, the paradigm, the example. From that point on, the referential theory of truth proceeds. Truth lies in the fact of the immediate correspondence of the given to the presumed invisible essence, or the nature that likes to hide according to Heraclitus. The pre-Socratics were at the forefront of this philosophy. The unfettered explosion of the modern technique is its logical result. Heidegger calls it Gestell and thinks it is the reason for the catastrophe and annihilation of mankind that inevitably approaches. According to him, the very concept of logos was wrong, so he proposed to radically revise our attitude to the very essence of philosophy and the process of thought, and to find another way which he called the other beginning. Logos first appeared with the birth of Western philosophy. The earliest Greek philosophy arose as something that already excluded chaos. Precisely at the same time, logos began to flourish, revealing a kind of mighty will to power and the absolutization of the masculine attitude to reality. The becoming of logocentric culture ontologically annihilated the polar opposite to logos itself, the feminine chaos. So chaos as something that preceded logos, was abolished by it, and its exclusivity were both manifested and dismissed at the same time. Masculine logos ousted feminine chaos. Exclusivity and exclusion subdued inclusivity and the inclusion. So the classical world was born, stretching its limits for 2,500 years up until modernity and the rationalist scientific era. This world has come to its end. But nevertheless, we are still living in its outskirts. At the same time, in the dissipating postmodern world, all the structures of order are degrading, dispersing, and becoming more and more confused. It is the dusk of logos, the end of order, the last chord of masculine, exclusivist domination. But still we are inside the logical structure rather than outside it. By stating this, we have conjured some basic solutions concerning the future. The first possible solution is the return to the kingdom of logos, the conservative revolution, the restoration of male full-scale domination in all spheres of the life in philosophy, religion, and in everyday life. This could be done spiritually, socially, or technically. This way where technique meets spiritual order was fundamentally explored and studied by Heidegger's friend, Ernst Jünger. It is a return to classicism accompanied by an appeal to technological progress. It is an effort to save the falling logos, the restoration of traditional society, and the eternally new order. The second possible solution is to accept the current trends and to follow the direction of confusion, becoming more and more involved in the dissipation of structure, in post-structuralism, and trying to get pleasure out of the comfortable glide into nothingness. That is the option chosen by the left and the liberal representatives of postmodernity. It is modern nihilism at its best, originally identified by Nietzsche and explored thoroughly by Heidegger. The concept of nothing being the potential present in the principle of identity proper to logos itself is not the limit of the process of the fall of the logical order, but rather the construction of a rational realm of the unlimited expansion of horizontal decay, the incalculable multitudes of the flowers of putrefaction. However, we could choose a third path and try to transcend the borders of logos and step out beyond the crisis of the postmodern world that is literally postmodern, i.e., lying beyond modernity, where the dissipation of logos reaches its limit. So the question of this very limit is crucial. Seen from the standpoint of logos in general, including its most decayed aspects, beyond the domain of order lies nothing. So crossing the border of being is ontologically impossible. Nothing is not, so speaks all logocentric Western ontology after Parmenides. This impossibility asserts the infiniteness of the outskirts of logos and grants to the decay, inside the realm of order, eternal continuity. Beyond the border of being lies nothing, and to move toward this limit is analytically infinite and unending. The aporia of Zeno of Elea are here fully valid. So no one can cross that frontier into the non-existent not being that simply is not. If we insist, nevertheless, in doing this, then we should appeal to chaos in its original Greek sense, as to something that proceeds being and order, something pre-ontological. We stand in front of a really important and crucial problem. A great number of people today are unsatisfied with what is going on around us, with the absolute crisis of values, religions, philosophy, political and social order, with postmodern conditions, with the confusion and perversion, and with this age of the utmost decay in general. But considering the essence of the decline of our civilization to the present state, we cannot look to the preceding phases of the logocentric order and its implicit structures, because it was precisely logos itself that has brought things to the state where they are now, bearing within itself the germs of the present decay. Heidegger identified, with extreme credibility, the roots of the technique in the pre-Socratic solution to the problem of being by means of logos. Logos cannot save us from the situation that it is the cause of. Logos is of no use to us here anymore. Only the pre-ontological chaos can give as a hint about how to go beyond the trap of postmodernity. It was put aside on the eve of the creation of the logical structure of being as a cornerstone. Now it is its turn to come into play. Otherwise, we will be doomed to accept the post-logical dissipated postmodernity that pretends to be eternal in some way because it annihilates time. Modernity has killed eternity and postmodernity is killing time. The architecture of the postmodern world is completely fragmented, perverse, and confused. It is a labyrinth without an exit, as folded and twisted as a Mobius strip. Logos, which was the guarantor of strictness and order, serves here instead to grant curvature and crookedness, being used to preserve the impassability of the ontological border with nothing from the eventual and inevitable trespassers seeking to escape into the beyond. So the only way to save ourselves, to save humanity and culture from this snare, is to take the step beyond the logocentric culture towards chaos. We cannot restore logos and order, because they bear in themselves the reason for their own eternal destruction. In other words, to save the exclusive logos, we should make an appeal to the alternative inclusive instance that is chaos. But how could we use the concept of chaos and base our philosophy on it if, up to now, philosophy has always been for us something logical by definition? In order to resolve this difficulty, we should approach chaos not from the position of logos but from that of chaos itself. It can be compared to the feminine vision, the feminine understanding of the other, that is not excluded but, on the contrary, included in the sameness. Logos regards itself as what is and as what is equal to itself. It can accept the differences inside itself, because it excludes the other that lies without. So the will to power is working, the law of sovereignty. Beyond logos, logos asserts, lies nothing, not something. So logos, excluding all other than itself, excludes chaos. Chaos uses a different strategy. It includes in itself all that it is, but at the same all that it is not. So all-inclusive chaos includes also what is not inclusive, namely that which excludes chaos. So chaos does not perceive logos as the other, but as itself, or as something non-existent. Logos as the first principle of exclusion is included in chaos, present in it, enveloped by it, and has a place granted inside of it, as the mother bearing the baby bears in herself what is a part of herself, and what is not a part of her at the same time. Man conceives woman as an external being and seeks to penetrate her. Woman considers man as something internal and seeks to give him a birth, and to give birth to him. Chaos is the eternal nascence of the other, that is, of logos. To sum up, chaotic philosophy is possible because chaos itself includes logos as some inner possibility. It can freely identify it, cherish it, and recognize its exclusivity included in its everlasting life. So we come to the figure of the very special, chaotic logos, that is, a completely and absolutely fresh logos being eternally revived by the waters of chaos. This chaotic logos is at the same time exclusive. This is why it is properly logos and inclusive, being chaotic. It deals with sameness and otherness differently. Chaos can think. We should ask her how she does this. We have asked logos. Now it is the turn of chaos. We must learn to think with chaos and within the chaos. I could suggest, as an example, the philosophy of the Japanese thinker Kitaro Nishida, who has constructed the logic of Basho, or the logic of places, in place of Aristotle's logic. We should explore other cultures, rather than Western, to try to find different examples of inclusive philosophy, inclusive religions, and so on. Chaotic logos is not only an abstract construction. If we seek well, we can find the real forms of such intellectual traditions in archaic societies, as well as in Eastern theology and mystical currents. To make an appeal to chaos is the only way to save logos. Logos needs a savior, it cannot save itself. It needs something opposite to itself to be restored in the critical situation of postmodernity. We could not transcend postmodernity. The latter cannot be overcome without appeal to something that has been prior to the reason of its decay. So we should resort to philosophies other than Western. In conclusion, it is not correct to conceive chaos as something belonging to the past. Chaos is eternal but eternally coexisting with time. Therefore, chaos is always absolutely new, fresh, and spontaneous. It could be regarded as a source of any kind of invention and freshness because its eternity has, in itself, always something more than was, is, or will be in time. Logos itself cannot exist without chaos, like fish cannot live without water. When we take a fish out of water, it dies. When the fish begins to insist excessively that there is something other than water around it, even if it is true, it comes to the shore and dies there. It is a kind of mad fish. When we put it back in the water, it only jumps out again. So let it die this way if it wants. There are other fishes deep in the water. Let us follow them. The astronomical era that is coming to an end is the era of the fish constellation of Pisces. The fish on the shore. The dying one. So we need water now very badly. Only a completely new attitude to thought, a new ontology, and a new gnosiology can save logos out of the water, on the shore, in the desert that grows and grows, as Nietzsche foresaw. Only chaos and the alternative philosophy based on inclusivity can save modern humanity and the world from the consequences of the degradation and decay of the exclusivist principle called logos. Logos has expired, and we all will be buried under its ruins unless we make an appeal to chaos and its metaphysical principles, and use them as a basis for something new. Perhaps this is the other beginning Heidegger spoke of,